Companies or guilds were amongst the earliest forms of organized business in India, an economic coming together of traders or skilled professionals, often family or community based. Until the East India Company brought to India the concept of a modern corporation, a chartered company issuing stock, paying dividends, and multinational in presence.
Devdutt Patnaik, welcome to the first episode on this series. I'm going to start by quoting from a well-known management thinker whose seminal work was The Fifth Discipline. He talks about learning organizations and organizational development, and in reference to India and China, he said, my intuition is they will move somewhat together, but in very distinctive ways. But I think the thing that will be really common to both of them will be the fact that they won't be able to do this without reconnecting to their heritage. They will have to develop a confidence that they can do this as Indians and they can do this as Chinese. They have learned a lot from the West, but they don't have to copy. They cannot create a Chinese or Indian version of a Western model. The Western model itself is basically bankrupt. It does not give enough attention to the human side of development. If the concept of corporations was borrowed from the West, is there an Indian way of doing business?
Yes, there is. To understand this, we have to understand the Indian context. And to understand what is the Indian context, we have to hear a story. And the story is of a long time ago when Alexander came to India. And he was the first European, one can say, who came to India. And he came to the banks of the Indus. And he met there a very strange man called a gymnosophist. He called it a gymnosophist because this man was naked and he seemed to be wise and everybody respected him. So Alexander asked the gymnosophist, because he was doing nothing, he was sitting over there staring at the stars. He says, what are you doing? And the gymnosophist said, I'm experiencing nothingness. And then the gymnosophist asked Alexander, what are you doing? Alexander said, I'm conquering the world. And they both laughed. Each one thought the other was a fool. Alexander felt that it's a waste of a life to do nothing. And the gymnosophist thought it's a waste of a life to do anything. Where from came these differences? If you understand these differences, we'll understand the difference between the Indian mindset and the Western mindset.
Okay.
You see, Alexander was told all his life that when you die, there is a river that you have to cross. It was called the Styx. And when you go to the other side, you'll be asked a question, have you done anything extraordinary in your life? And if you've done something extraordinary or spectacular, you will go to the place that the French call Champs-Élysées or Elysium, which is reserved for heroes. Otherwise, you have to go to the asphodel fields, which is meant for commoners. And so Alexander was told always to do something spectacular. And he was told stories of heroes like Hercules and Theseus and the epics like Iliad and Odyssey. This is what he was told. But this is not the story that the gymnosophist heard. You see, the gymnosophist heard a different story. He was also told of a river which separates the land of the living from the land of the dead. But you see, don't you make the journey once. You make the journey to and fro endlessly.
That's what the gymnosophist was told.
Which means you're living again and again and again and again. It's not one time. You have many chances. So now this changes perspective. Imagine one person who's told you live only once. His life is full of sense of urgency. He wants to do everything in this one life because that's the only life he has got. The denominator of Alexander's life was one. Now look at the gymnosophist. He can live many, many times. Not only does he live many, many times, he can live the same life again and again because it's cyclical. What goes around comes around. So the denominator of the gymnosophist's life is infinity. So the value of his life, no matter what he did, was zero. The value of Alexander's life was the sum total of his achievements. So the focus of Greek narratives has been achievement. The gymnosophist, the focus is, so if nothing is of value, then what's the point of his life? Introspect. Figure it out. Figure it out. So you do many things. You have to do many things in life, but the point is not the doing. The point is figuring out why are you doing what you are doing. So the two paradigms are different. Therefore, the Indian way of doing business was not about doing business, but using the act of doing business to figure out Why are you doing what you're doing? Question it. And in that there is growth, intellectual growth and emotional growth.
I understand this is our conditioning, and that's why, and in the context of this, you're explaining what the Indian way of doing business could potentially be.
Yes.
My only issue with this is that this is so much more achievement focused. It comes with a sense of urgency, both qualities that are imperative in the world of business.
Yes.
You've got to achieve, you've got to do it fast. Is the Indian way of doing things, living life, the infinity, best suited to the notion or the concept of profitable businesses as we know them today?
You see, when we use the word profitable business, who says it's a good thing? Humans say it is a good thing.
No, profits are a good thing because they allow you to think of ideas, make something constructive of them, earn of them, not just for yourself, but to be able to share the wealth, run an organization efficiently. So profit is not a bad thing.
How much profit? Give me the perfect number. That's where the problem is, isn't it? It's not about profit. Everybody understands profit. But how much profit? How do we know it is not motivated by greed? And is greed okay? If you're saying greed is okay, then of course it's a moot point, then we don't discuss it. Then the question comes, no, greed is not okay, but what is need in greed? Now that's a conversation. Let's figure out the conversation. And that's where introspection comes in. Why do I want to grow is an important question. We can delude ourselves with politically correct answers that we're doing to generate wealth, but what's the actual reason? What's the real belief? Maybe it's self-aggrandizement. I don't want to be a head of a 100 crore store. I want to be a 100 crore company. I want to be a leader of a 10,000 crore company. Then I feel good about myself. So then the purpose of business is not to generate wealth for the community. It is to feel good about myself. And that's a problem.
If in India the belief is also wealth and not only wealth, the core question that most of us are faced with in our daily existence as our corporations, what is the purpose of a corporation? What is the motivation that should ideally drive a corporation? Should it not be profitability? Because profitability is also equal to a certain efficient way of running, a certain distribution of wealth. And profits can only come if you produce goods and products that consumers want in the best, most efficient fashion.
Absolutely.
So profitability, is it wealth? Is it generosity? Is it ambition? Is it greed? What should the purpose and motivation of a corporation be?
I think the motivation of a corporation is to create happiness. In India, currency is of three types, and it was represented using the three goddesses. So you have one goddess called Lakshmi. So you have this goddess who is sort of famous for sitting on a lotus. Everywhere in India you have this image. She sits on a lotus.
Right.
She holds a pot which is overflowing with wealth. And you have another goddess. And this goddess is famous because she holds a lute in her hand, and she is Saraswati,
Right.
the goddess of knowledge.
Right.
And there's a third goddess. And if you go to Bombay's Mumbai Devi temple, or if you go to the Mahalakshmi temple, for example, you will see these three goddesses, and one holds a trident, and she's called Durga.
Durga.
So you have, forgive me, but now this has unfortunately become a very infamous term. It's LSD. One is material, tangible wealth.
Right.
The other is intellectual wealth. And the third one is emotional wealth. And these are the three things that two human beings transact with each other.
Why does Durga represent emotional wealth?
You see, Durga is, the more popular name of Durga is also called Shakti,
Right.
which is power. Now, if I walk into a party and look at you and say, Ma, you have gained a lot of weight since the last time I met.
Thank you.
You'll feel depressed. So you feel suddenly disempowered. But a sentence. Or I come in and say, you know what, you're looking wonderful and radiant, and the clothes you're wearing are lovely, and you look really nice. And suddenly you feel empowered. So what has happened is an emotional transaction has taken place, and we don't even realize it's actually a currency that can be used very, very well between two people. And we yearn and crave for this emotional currency. Everybody wants it. Even the gods want it. So you have a material need, you have an intellectual need, and you have an emotional need. And organizations have to work at all three levels. The question is somewhere along the line, the balance scorecard, if you look at it carefully, is about LSD.
Okay, one of the conflicts continuously in the creation and sustenance of corporations really is the ability to balance short-term with long-term, right?
Yes.
Now, professionally speaking, there are lots of glib quotes that can help you understand this situation, right? Jack Welch, who's one of the most famous management thinkers in the world, and therefore, and also venerated for the success that he brought to General Electric, said anybody can manage short, anybody can manage long. Balancing those two things is what management is all about.
Okay.
What does our mythology say about whether you need to be short-termed, whether you need to be long-termed? And if you're going to choose the middle path and tell me, Menka, you need to be bits of both, please tell me how we achieve that.
You see, when you look at mythology, there is Vishnu, the god who sustains the world, is associated with two animals. One is called a serpent, a sarpa, or shesh, and another is a eagle, Garuda. There's something called Garuda Drishti, which is long sight, and there is Sarpa Drishti, which is immediate goals. The question is, what should I focus on first?
Right.
When you look at how the story of creation happens in India, the moment they talk about creation, they also talk about its destruction. They talk immediately about destruction, which means you don't just talk about the building of the organization. At the day it is begun, you discuss how it's going to die. It's not assumed to be immortal, because mortality is a universal truth, and you are aware of it. So you're discussing mortality. And then you say that, okay, if I'm going to be born and I'm going to die, how do I live a healthy and happy life? And how long can I sustain it? If that applies to health, the same thing applies to organizations. Unfortunately, the way we are structured, we break it down into bits. You see, we break it down into bits. And when a CEO takes over, for example, he's told your lifespan is 2 years or 3 years, and you have to win every year. You're not allowed to lose. So effectively, he's under pressure on the Sarpa Drishti. The shareholder says, I want winning every year, growth. Every year you have to grow, year on year, grow, be profitable. And that's where and I'm told that that's the measurement, and I'm told that's the reward. And if I'm going to last for 3 years, so I'll just make sure that I win 3 years. I'm not thinking about 30 years and 300 years. So perforce the system is saying Sarpa Drishti.
How do you correct that? Because you're always going to have someone in charge for a limited period of time. Yes. They're going to try and excel within that limited period of time, and therefore for them, short-termism will always be the first goal to achieve, as opposed to long-termism. I understand that the ideal should be long-termism, but not all of us can actually put that bill in that sense.
See, in the health case, you see, you can't escape the consequences.
You can't, and it's personal.
Yes. In an organization, you say, I can escape the consequences.
Because I want to be around. I will not be CEO, maybe.
You see, look at this is slightly more technical and beyond my space, but if I'm a shareholder of the company, what I need from the company is wealth. I don't care if the company, if it does something horrible, I won't be held responsible for it, right? That's what's limited. When it's called a limited company, the shareholder is not responsible for the horrible things the company does.
Right.
So
but he will have to bear the downside risk.
He just loses money.
Yes, but he's not complete. Yeah, well, that's an important thing, isn't it?
Yeah, but if the faraway country is polluted by it,
he doesn't have to bear the ill
so,
effects.
I mean, this company will shut down. I lose some money, but I still maintain my lifestyle. So I'm not responsible for my consequences. So I just focus on that one side. I'm saying I'm not responsible for consequences. So give me my money back. I behave like a money lender. And I say, give me my money back. I don't behave like a shareholder. I behave like a money lender. So I've given you 10 rupees, you give me 20 rupees next month. And if you don't give it, I'll throw you out of the CEO position. So I own my vision is short term. I'm not responsible for the long term sustenance. So in a way, I have built into the system freedom from consequences.
Interestingly, you've made the case for family-owned businesses, right? For almost 10 years now in this country, we've looked at the phrase family-owned business with some amount of contempt. It's again a Western concept that we have all inherited over the past 20, 30, 40 years, that ideally an organization must have separation between ownership and management. It should be professionally run, and it should be run for the benefit of all stakeholders, as opposed to the benefit of the entrepreneur that may have started that organization. But there the problem is that if you're going to have leaders that come in for limited periods of time, they're going to be concerned with their immediate term.
Yes.
So short-termism.
Yes.
But if you have organizations owned by families that will patronize these organizations, help them sustain, help them grow over generations,
Yes.
that is long-termism.
Yes.
You're making the case then for family-owned businesses, a phrase that we've looked down upon in some ways for the last 10 to 15 years.
Look at the word professional. We are using it again without context. We're saying anywhere, anytime, if it's professional, it's good. Let's now decode professional. What does it mean, be professional? It means cut out emotions. Be logical.
Cut out the D.
So D does not matter.
Yes.
So out of the three goddesses, which for 3,000 years has been celebrated in India, we think one goddess is out.
Right.
Power. And please note, that is the one thing that we crave for as human beings. We want to feel powerful. And if I look at it physiologically, you're saying focus on the left brain. The right brain is bad. Right brain is not good. Focus on the left brain. And that's, we're saying that is good for the organization. The problem with the family-owned business is that it focuses too much on the right brain. So my son is better. My son may not be better. You see, India is called Bharat, and we forget a story of the name, this character called Bharat. There are many Bharats, of course, in mythology, but one very obscure story which is amazing, and I found it very interesting, is about the son of Shakuntala. And he had many wives and many sons, but he rejected all the sons. And we don't know why. He said, he doesn't look like me. That's the literal translation. But perhaps, and then what he does is he adopts, or he's given by the gods, a son who's actually an illegitimate child, rejected by his parents, an orphan. And he elevates him to be the heir. If I decode the story, it's basically saying a king who rejected his own biological children in favor of a son who was good enough to rule. And we are named after that man, Bharata, Bharata.
It is equal to meritocracy.
Indra, king of gods and the lord of heaven, is in constant pursuit of success and wealth. Lakshmi. But Lakshmi prefers the side of Vishnu. Are you Indra chasing success? Or are you Vishnu with success chasing you? Therein lie the answers to who is a leader and ideal leadership qualities.
Well, Indra really is not a leader, because you see, the definition of a leader here we are talking about is someone, what is Vishnu's role? He is taking care of the world, which means his reference point of action is the world, others, not him. It's not about self-actualization. He's not trying to actualize himself. He's taking care of others, and in just doing that, he becomes a fortune magnet.
Okay.
Indra, on the other hand, is taking care of nobody.
Except for himself.
Self-actualization.
All right. So Indra is self-focused and therefore insecure and therefore chases Lakshmi.
Right.
Vishnu is focused on the other, therefore more secure, and therefore Lakshmi chases him.
No, he's not secure because he looks at the other. He is secure and therefore looks at the other.
All right. And yet when we talk about the creation of the world, we talk about three gods.
Yes.
At least this is popular perception. I may
Yes,
be
yes.
wrong. Brahma, the creator.
Yes.
Vishnu, the god that maintains. And Shiva, the destroyer. Why is Vishnu the most important of these three gods and the most revered as well?
When you're talking about creation, even the word creation, when you use the word creation, there is implicitly we are visualizing the God as it is told in the Bible, creates the world. But in the Indian context, the one who's creating the world is not worshipped. The one who's destroying the world is being worshipped. Now, either we are mad or there's a problem with our understanding of the words. Creating what? Destroying what? Preserving what is the question to be asked. You see, Brahma's action, when you read the scriptures, is a God who is yearning constantly. He's chasing things because he's seeking to understand who he is. And therefore, he creates the world to answer this question of who he is. And when he creates the world, rather than figuring out the answer, he starts chasing it and wants to possess it and want to control it, and he wants to dominate it. And he's lost his identity, he's lost his original purpose, and he's forgotten. and therefore should not be worshipped because he's yearning, he's chasing the wrong thing. One could say that this Brahma is Aham Brahmasmi, you and I, human beings, we're chasing something and we're losing sight of what we really want, and we have to introspect to figure what it is. On the other hand, the gods who are worshipped are Vishnu and Shiva. Neither of these gods chase the goddess, but the goddess comes to them. Now, the difference between these two gods is Shiva says the world doesn't matter. This is all Maya, this is delusion. I shut my eyes to the world and I switch off.
So he gives up.
He lets go. While Vishnu says, well, the world doesn't matter, so let's enjoy it. So it's a question of perspective. Three different characters in mythology who are engaging with three currencies in a very different way. One says, I yearns for Lakshmi, Saraswati and Durga. Yearns, searching for it. That's Brahma. That's you and I. That's an average human being. On the other extreme is Shiva, who just switches off and says,
I don't want any of this.
I don't want any of this. So he's the Vairagi, the hermit.
Right, the
Completely
ascetic.
Ascetic. And what is he surrounded by? Cold, icy mountains.
Right.
Destruction. He's switched off. And the goddess goes to him and says, you know what, you may have figured it out, but the rest of the world hasn't, so please open the eyes. And so she marries him. So she goes to him and appeals to him and says, you know what, engage with the world, engage with the world. So you have two forms of Shiva, that is Shiva, whose eyes are shut, and Shankara,
Whose eyes are open.
whose eyes are open. He is the benevolent one, the boon-giving one.
So he's still, there is still attachment in him.
Engagement in him.
Engagement in him.
The words are important because they have different meanings. Now, Vishnu
Is the
is the
preserver.
god, is the preserver. His eyes are always open. So when you go to Vishnu temple, the eyes are always open. He's looking at you and he's amused by you. He's amused because, you see, we are all Brahmas, and he's saying, you know what, your direction is wrong. And he's smiling and he's helping. He is the caring God. He's helping you. Very similar to Shankara.
And so this is what we need to try and be.
This is what a leader should be, which means he has to be wise enough to care. So a leader is someone who enables you to grow materially, L, intellectually, S, and emotionally, D. That's the role of the leader. And in doing so, grows himself. So your growth becomes his growth.
But why is the creator, the man who has helped create all of this, not given equal,
See, what has he created? See, we have to go back to the scriptures. He has created desire. He has created ignorance. He has created the chase. He has created the rat race. Brahma has created a rat race. Would you worship the creator of the rat race? Or will you worship the person who tells you how to step out from the rat race and still have the goddess of wealth chasing you? You decide.
You believe that the various avatars of Vishnu actually represent leadership at different stages of a corporation's life, leadership in different phases of a corporation's life. Is that correct?
Before answering any question on avatars, we have to understand Vishnu. You see, when you look at Vishnu's image, you see, what is mythology? I mean, mythology is a communication of ideas through forms, of ideas that people respected. Now, Vishnu is managing the world, and he has got something called a conch shell,
Right.
which is Shank. Then he has got a wheel on the other side, which is called a Chakra. Then he has got a mace in one hand, a club, which is Gada, and he has a lotus flower called a Padma on the other. Look at it carefully. This is for communicating. Wheel for reviewing, Gada for discipline, and Padma for appreciation. And any good leader does the same thing. He has to communicate, he has to review, he has to discipline you if you're not online, and he has to appreciate if you've done good things.
So it is this image that in many ways represents the ideal traits of leadership.
Ideal traits of leadership. You see, you don't see a rule book anywhere, do you?
No, but if he needed to discipline, he would need to discipline according to a set of rules, right?
Yes, but every rule exists in a context. So there cannot be fixed rules. There has to be a fixed principle. And that context is explained using the concept of yuga in mythology.
Okay.
So they say that when the life cycle of the world has 4 parts, it is going to die, just as human beings will die one day. We have youth, then we have maturity, old age, senility.
And in many ways, this represents the many phases that a corporation goes through as well.
So all the yugas will have different set of rules based on a common principle called dharma. Dharma is a principle,
not religion,
not a code of conduct, and certainly not religion.
Right.
So we have to understand the principle of dharma, and then we have to understand the concept of yoga, and then you'll understand the role of the avatars. In each of these yugas there is a separate avatar, each one upholding dharma but following very different rules.
Okay.
And that's why, for example, you have Ram, who is ekam patni vrata, faithful to one wife, and you have Krishna, who is a lover of beautiful many women. How do you reconcile the two?
And both are gods.
And both are gods, and both are upholding dharma, but the rules are very different. Okay. So you have Krishna, who is Radha and Rukmini and Satyabhama and Jambavati. Ram, only Sita. And Parshuram, there is no wife around. Where is the wife? There is no wife around. So 3 gods, 3 different rules.
So one overarching principle, different kinds of leadership required in different phases of the life cycle of an organization. But all feeding in or all abiding by that one overarching principle. All right. Why then, if all these 4 are equal, they just represent different phases and different styles of leadership, is one greater than the rest? For instance, every time we talk of a perfect society, we call it Ram Rajya. It is supposed to be heaven on earth,
yes,
right? In many ways.
Yes.
There are many other leaders, there are many other gods. Why is Ram revered so much more than the rest of them?
Remember, that's the only form of God which is visualized as a king. Krishna is not king, he's a king maker. You worship Krishna as a cowherd and a charioteer, not as a king. Ram is the only deity of all the deities in India. There's so many temples in India. There's only one deity who is visualized as a king. That's Ram. So there's only one king we're talking about who is worshipped.
But it can't be his position that draws the faithful, right? The fact that he's king is not instrumental in why he's so revered.
The divinity is indifferent to his role because he is Vishnu. So he's cowherd, he's charioteer. Remember, these are...
So why are you laying so much emphasis on the kingliness of him?
Because he is doing what a king is supposed to do. He's living the life of... He's behaving as a king is supposed to be. And that's what Ram is associated with. And what is that it's supposed to be? He is living for the people, to the point that when given a choice between an honest and faithful wife and a cruel subjects, cruel, unjust, unfair subjects, what does the king take a decision? He chooses his cruel subjects and rejects his faithful wife. It's the classic conflict between personal life and professional life. And he chooses the professional life over the personal life. He sacrifices it.
But the professional life for the good of the people, not the professional life for his own personal advancement in the professional life.
Absolutely. If you look at our legends, not mythology, but legends, people who have sacrificed their children are put on a higher pedestal because we know how impossible that is. It's impossible.
So
you cannot
Ram
do that.
Rajya is almost the attainment of the impossible.
It is the attainment of the impossible because it is about sacrificing what you love most dearest and love for others.
Why is success so individualistic? When we talk about, in the context of business, of course, successful companies, we almost always connect them to one overwhelmingly successful individual. Almost everything about the success of leadership connects to that leader. We rarely praise the board of Apple, but Steve Jobs is God.
Yes.
Similarly for Microsoft, but Bill Gates is God. Similarly for Reliance Industries, Dhirubhai Ambani, though is a legend for what he has achieved. Why is success so individualistic when everything in mythology seems to be talking about the community, the other, the outside?
Okay. Everything in Indian mythology talks about the other and the outside. The Western mythology is a complex combination between Greek ideas and biblical ideas.
Right.
Now, in the biblical idea, there is God and there is prophet. And the prophet brings the rules of God to man, and we have to align to the rules. And the prophet is subject to these rules. He's not independent of the rules. He's not creator of these rules. He's subject to these rules. The Greek model is very different. The Greek model, the hero is someone who challenges the gods, who fights the gods, and who triumphs despite the gods.
Okay.
Now, when we use the word leader today in common parlance, these words have come from the Western context.
Right.
And when they are using the word leader, they're referring to the heroes of Greek mythology who challenge the gods, that is the status quo, who challenge the establishment and innovate and create something new,
Right.
breakthrough. They're the Hercules of modern times. And Hercules is always alone. Have you seen Hercules with family?
No.
Or Theseus or Jason? None of them are with family. They're these individuals, and you never, some of them are kings, but you never hear about their kingdom. You hear about their great adventures. And all our leadership books that we have are basically Greek heroes.
When we're that individualistically oriented, and if the board is not as responsible or as revered, the board is always going to come second to the individual leader.
Yes.
If the board always comes second to the individual leader, let me go back to the conversation we had in the very first episode. How is the board ever going to be able to stand up to that leader?
This is the great Western conflict, the individual versus the community. The individual versus the community.
In the Indian context, how do you apply
It's
the
not achievement
concept of
which makes
leadership?
Ram worthy of worship. It is sacrifice that makes him worthy of worship. So I would actually argue a leader has to begin as Parshuram, then become Ram, evolve into Krishna. And if
finally?
unfortunate, may have to become Buddha or Kalki, depending on the situation. These are the avatars. So Parshuram is rule follower, very early. He's like this very strict teacher who punishes you if you break the rules. So it's very early phase in the organization, Krita Yoga, the early days. Then he becomes the model reader who hopes by being a model of sacrifice that people will understand the meaning of sacrifice. Because the whole kingdom is watching this great king serving them, having sacrificed his own personal
So
happiness.
he leads by example.
He leads by example. And eventually becomes Krishna, who is the ultimate coach.
Okay.
He's coaching and creating new talent and hoping that the Pandavas will become like Ram. They don't. They gamble away their own kingdom, thinking that kingdom is property. So he has to put them through a great period of vanavas and sort of repair the damage and get them back. And there's a lot of bloodshed which happens.
Right.
So he's coaching them. And finally becomes Buddha, where he switches off,
Detaches.
withdraws. Or Kalki, who just breaks the system completely because it's not worth upholding anymore.
So either you withdraw if it's worth sustaining,
Because the kings are there to take care of it, then it's the ashrama. You have become the great ascetic.
or you destroy it because it's not worth maintaining
It's not
anymore.
worth maintaining anymore. And that becomes the Kalki. So it's a very beautiful narrative, which is in a way saying evolution of leadership. It's not becoming one style, it's context. Early phases, Parshuram. Perfect phase, Ram. Then become Krishna, create talent, and then move out. Go away. The world will continue without you. It has been continuing for
And if it
millions of
doesn't
years.
deserve to continue, it will self-implode.
It will self-implode. So chhod do.
Detach.
Humans are the only creatures on earth who can choose to overturn the law of the jungle, to outgrow the beast within us. Firing this eternal struggle is our ability to imagine. Imagine a better place.
But the problem with imagination is also that it amplifies our fears.
Right.
Because what does an imagination do? I can think of the worst situations. I can imagine problems which don't exist.
Right.
Even in times of abundance, I can think of drought and go into depression. So, it's a tragedy of imagination. While it can give me, I can imagine good things, I can also imagine horrible
The
things.
worst things.
So it amplifies joy, it amplifies fear.
Right.
And the most tragic and interesting thing about imagination is suddenly we ask ourselves, because we can imagine, and because we are aware we can die, we start asking the question, what's the point of it all? And that's where everything starts. That's the home, that is the source of our solutions and our problems.
How is it connected to Dharma?
You see, I can imagine not being afraid. So if you look at all the gods, they have their hands sticking out, and what are they saying? Don't be afraid.
Right.
This is the Abhaya Mudra. Of course, it's also a political symbol today, so we should be careful.
Right.
But the fact is, Abhaya means don't be afraid. And every deity in India, everyone, is holding the hands out and saying, and that's what a leader is supposed to do. Now, what is Dharma? Just visualize a simple number chart. There's a positive axis, there's a negative axis, and the number 0.
Right.
Now imagine the number 0 as what is called in Sanskrit Matsya Nyaya, or law of the jungle. Big fish can eat the small fish in the sea, which means I'm allowed to be territorial, I can be dominating because I want to survive. That's an animal instinct.
Right.
If I can outgrow this animal instinct of survival, which means I start thinking about others, I empathize because I can imagine your fear. And because I can imagine your fear, I can empathize with you. If I can work towards empathy, that is outgrowing the beast. But if I allow the fear to amplify my fear, then in my fear, I will say that, okay, I have to stay alive and I have to thrive and others don't matter. Nobody else matters but me. Then I'll start exploiting people. I will tame other people, I'll dominate, I'll become worse than an animal. Animals don't exploit, humans do. Animals are not cruel, humans are cruel. So exploitation comes in. This comes from the human imagination. Both of this, exploitation and empathy, come from the same space. The human ability to imagine and be creative. So both are possible. Now if I move in this direction, then this is Dharma. So it's a work in progress. It's not an end point, it's not a destination. It's a process. If I move in the opposite direction, overwhelmed by fear, this comes from fear only, it's adharma. The choice is ours, and every choice has consequences. So, and if not in this life, then in the next life. You evolve in the next life. Where will you go?
What is the Dharma sankat then?
A Dharma sankat is the ability to take this decision. You see, in what is life all about? Every moment we have to take decisions. At a moment of time, what do I decide? What decision do I take? Let me give you an example through a story. Once upon a time, there was an eagle, and the eagle was chasing a dove. And the dove came to a king and told the king that, save me. And the king said, I will save you. And then the eagle said, what will I eat now? So he said, eat another dove. So that's cruel. He says, why is that cruel? He said, to save one dove, why should another dove die? Then he said, okay, then eat a rat. And the eagle said, that's cruel. Why should a rat die to save this dove? So finally the king said, eat me. And he said, you're a foolish king. How long can you feed me? Sooner or later you will die. And I'll have to eat the dove. So you're just delaying its death. This is Dharma sankat. You see, in nature, nobody would have come to the rescue of the dove. Now the king thinks he's very noble in saving the dove. It's a human imagination, right? You're imagining that by saving the dove, I'm being a nice man. But you're being, in effect, cruel to the eagle. You decided that the eagle is bad and the dove needs saving. Now look what is happening. The dove is calling the king a kind king, and the eagle is calling the king a cruel king. Who is right? What should the king do?
What should the king do?
There is no prescription.
How do you fit this in a business or corporate context, just considering the large number of companies that you've interacted with, that the fact that you have deep insight into one large business group right now? What are the more common Dharma sankat situations that business leaders face, and how are they supposed to overcome it if there is no prescription?
So there's a recession. I have to cut costs. I have two ways of cutting costs. Reduce salaries of the top management, or give pink slips to the bottom of the pyramid. Which way should I go?
Well, the former sounds less cruel.
Yeah, but try taking it.
But to those people, it's as cruel, right?
Yeah, so take it. Because that would mean those top management, which is running your organization, may leave. And the company can collapse. And the shareholders will withdraw money.
What do you do?
That's Dharma sankat.
And there is no prescription of how to manage
That's what
Sankat
makes
situation.
a king. That's why you need a leader. If there was a prescription out there, then why do you need a leader? You have to ask yourself, if I have to evolve, I have to ask myself, why do I take the decision? Where from comes the decision that I'm taking? Am I taking the decision because I'm afraid am I doing it to protect myself? Am I doing to protect my self-image? Am I doing to protect my business, which is actually an extension of my self-image? Or am I doing it for the good of the people? More often than not, it is never for the good of the people.
The one predominant conflict that exists, at least in the context of business, is the relationship between the owner and the organization, management and ownership. I can find different ways of putting it, but that is the one key area of conflict. It's the one area that all the Western governance rules seem to actually try and control, mitigate. And yet in India, it is the biggest issue that we face when we talk about corporate governance, when we talk about organizational behavior or leadership traits, this whole relationship between the owner and the organization.
You see, in the Western construct, the organization is independent of the leader. While in the Indian context, the organization is a manifestation of the leader. So Raja and Rajya are integral to each other.
Right.
This is one fundamental thing. Now, let's look at it in the form of a story. In the Mahabharata, you have this, everybody talks about this very honest man called Yudhishthira. And then we talked about a gambling episode. He gambles. He gambles his kingdom. And I've heard people talking about this episode and, apparent people who are telling the story of the Mahabharata repeatedly. And nobody is asking a very fundamental question.
Was it his to give away?
Was it his to give away? We talk about how Draupadi asked the question. And she's asking the question that if a man has gambled himself, can he gamble what he will? And everybody's assuming that she's asking about her.
Yes.
But she's actually asking about everything. She's saying, on what basis has he gambled the kingdom away? Is the kingdom the king's property?
Is it?
No. Why does the kingdom exist? That's the fundamental question. If it is existing to mitigate my fear, then it's adharma, no?
So you're going in the wrong direction.
If it is to mitigate my people's fear, then it's dharma. Now, how are you mitigating fear by gambling it away?
That's one extreme example. But if you were to look at modern day business, right? The owner, the promoter, is the person who vests the most or invests the most in that business, both from a money point of view, from an emotion, energy, risk, everything. Why then does he not get to, in some sense, stay owner for the rest of his life and treat this like his kingdom?
See,
why does he have to treat it equally?
In India, the relationship of the king and the kingdom was that between a cowherd and a cow. You see, if you see wealth as milk, where does the milk come from? It comes from a cow.
Right.
What is good milk? Rich in bottom line, so makhan wala doodh. So it's a good cow. Now the cow is, does the milk belong to the cowherd or does it belong to the cow?
It belongs to the cow.
It belongs to the cow. But you see, there is a nice relationship between the cowherd and the cow. The cowherd takes care of the cow.
Right.
In exchange, takes a portion of the milk. So that's the relationship between the cowherd and the cow. And therefore, the king is Govind, keeper of the cow. Now, what's a cow, if you think at a logical? We can take it literally. But when a king gives a cow to another man, what has he done? He's given the person a lifetime of food and fuel, that is milk and dung, which effectively means you've given him survival. You've allowed him to live. In other words, a cow or godan is job creation. I've created a job so that he can sustain himself forever. So the more cows I give, or it is basically creating employment. So the more people can live. And why do they need to live? Otherwise, they are at the mercy of the elements. And that's the great king who distributes many cows. But does he own the cow? That relationship is one of trusteeship. He's the trustee of the cow.
This is very simple to understand when there is one king and one cow.
Yes.
If you were to expand it in the context of an organization, let's assume the king is the promoter or the entrepreneur or the founder, right?
Yes.
But thereafter, the king himself alone is not able to take care of the cow. The king needs the help of other people.
Yes.
And therefore, the right on the milk gets distributed amongst those other people, who also help in taking care of the cow.
Yes.
Now, is it proportional? Should it be distributed disproportionately because it is the king actually who began the entire process of taking care of the cow, but the others came on later? So this is the question that constantly gets asked in India, right? Can the promoter undertake actions that benefit himself as the shareholder, and by the way, benefit other shareholders as well, because they benefit him, the shareholder.
Yes.
Is that fair? Is that not fair? Or should all his actions be taken from the other shareholder's point of view?
See, first thing is, what is fair? It's subjective. Fairness is a subjective concept. Second, we're talking about equality. In India, you're equal at a soul level. So Atma is equal, but the flesh is not.
But yet there are inequalities expressed in our being.
But there are inequalities based on our intellectual makeup, our emotional makeup, and our material makeup.
So what you're saying then is that the founder, the promoter, the entrepreneur rightfully deserves more based on the risks and the effort that he has undertaken.
You see, the word right, I'm sorry, everything breaks down with India.
It's subjective. Don't say it. I said it. No?
Right is not an Indian concept. Its duty is an Indian concept. Our entire culture is based on the concept of duty. Duty is for the other. Right is for the self. So when you say, this is my right, you have in a way provoked the animal instinct of territoriality. It is mine. For what? So we are celebrating the territoriality of our being, which means we are celebrating the animal, which is celebrating the animal instinct, the imagination and amplification of fear.
And you're going the wrong way.
And you're going the wrong way. Now the question is, no law can say that. You have to figure it out yourself.
No number of rules.
So
can
it's your
actually stop you
duty
from
that
doing
how much are you giving to people? Now this, remember, it goes to inner space, inner landscape. No rule can tell me that, if you give me 10% it is fair, and if you give me 12% it's unfair. It's not that. It's the king who has to decide. And that's why the kings were worshipped once upon a time. They were put on a pedestal and, the Abhishek rituals were done on them. Because
and yet they routinely gambled away their kingdoms, or they lost their kingdoms in war, which was the desire to expand their kingdoms. So if the relationship between the king and the kingdom was one of trust and trusteeship, we don't have that many examples of kings that actually upheld that principle.
Yes. Because, you see, we're talking about the struggle to be perfect. The struggle to be human, not even perfect. The struggle to step out of our animal desire to dominate, our animal desire to be territorial. 99% of our being is animal. The struggle is to make 99 into 98. We'll never overcome our animal, we become gods. Can we make 99, 98? And that's the Indian method, introspective. Rules will create domesticated animals. They will not create humans.
We've discussed Dharma, we've discussed Dharma Sankat. Both the Mahabharat and the Ramayan sort of talk of many different instances of what is the road to Dharma, the principle, and what constitutes Dharma Sankat, right? We have a very interesting question in from Ajay Piramal, referring to both these great books and what he draws from them.
What are the learnings that we can get to apply in the modern world from the Mahabharat and also from the Ramayan? And sometimes on first reading, it looks that there are several contradictions into what is said in Mahabharat and what is said in Ramayan. Can you just explain that to us?
You see, Ramayan and Mahabharat are both considered itihas. Now, itihas is conventionally translated as history, but it actually means, it's a tense agnostic term, which means so it was, so it is, and so it will be. That means it is timeless.
Right.
One. Second is, let's look at the Ramayan and the Mahabharat. They exist in two different contexts, so they cannot be seen as equals. And that's the mistake. The Western mind forces us to look at them as equal
why don't
books.
the two communicate the same message
thing? Because
to us?
you see, you are standardization, obsessed with standardization. But हमारा क्या स्वादानुसार है? तो एक स्वाद है द्वापर युग का, एक स्वाद है त्रेता युग का. So one is for the Treta Yuga, which is an earlier, more innocent age, and a later phase in the organization, which is darker, which is slightly more corrupt.
Okay.
Now, if I have to do the principle of Dharma again, just to revise, you have got 0, plus, minus, 0, animal instinct.
Right.
This is exploitation, this is empathy.
Right.
Dharma is here, adharma is here.
Right.
Now let's do a simple 2x2 matrix to understand the Ramayana and Mahabharata. So you have rules on one side.
Right.
Rules are followed, rules are not followed.
Okay.
Then we have the principle on the other side, dharma. Dharma is upheld, dharma is not upheld.
Right.
Now look at the Ramayan. In Ramayan, Dharma is upheld and rules are upheld at the same time. So you have Ram. So rules and Dharma are aligned. Everything is about the other. Everything is about the other. Everything is about the other.
Even at the cost of oneself.
Even at the cost of oneself.
Almost always at the cost of oneself in the case of Ram.
Almost always.
Yes.
So it's misery in the forest, misery in the palace.
Got it.
His opposite is the great alpha male, which somehow people seem to like today, tells you about the times, is Ravan.
No Dharma, no rules.
No rules, no Dharma. Your wife is my wife.
Right.
And I'm an animal. Even my son dies, I will not let go of my little toy. My brothers die, I will not let go of my little toy. That's Ravan. Now look at this same thing. Rules are broken, bending, and Krishna always bending the rules, breaking the rules. But the principle is intact. It's always for the other.
Okay.
Now let's look at the most favorite character, Duryodhana. He never breaks the rule.
But he's constantly violating the principle.
He's constantly violating the principle. He is holding the letter of the law, never the spirit of the law.
Okay.
This is the spirit. This is the letter. This is the belief. This is the behavior. He's a pretender.
Where does Yudhishthir fit in all of this?
Yudhishthira is someone struggling to be Ram. He moves from here to here. This is the journey of Yudhishthira with the help of Krishna. You see, his honesty is about rules. He's not realizing it's not about rules, it's about principles.
Right.
Mahabharat is the story of focus on the principle. You say, so when a woman is being disrobed, everybody is discussing legal matters. Is it okay or not okay to disrobe her? I mean, grow up. This is Bhishma and Drona watching a woman being disrobed, and they are supposed to be very educated people, and they are not doing anything.
This brings me to a very interesting issue. You said that the Ramayan comes from an older age, an age of more innocence. The Mahabharat comes from a darker age.
Yes. It's a more matured organization. This is a very early phase organization. Just tasted success. Everything is right. Market is right.
And the principles have just been created.
So it's exciting and new. People are not smart enough to subvert it yet.
Right. Here, in this stage, you've gone from principle to now a slightly more rule-focused organization.
The principles have been forgotten. Rules have become more important. So it's bureaucratic, highly bureaucratic. Letter of the law. Spirit of the law is not there. Like any bureaucracy, all the rules are upheld, but people still don't have food. So the principle is forgotten. The woman is disrobed, but nobody's arrested.
The Anunnaki of ancient Sumerian texts were a council of gods and goddesses, perhaps the earliest known form of a consultative group. A concept that in modern business is referred to as the board of directors.
Well, I would ask a question about corporate governance. I recognize that companies are social structures, and we've imported the corporate concept from the West. But at the end of the day, people interact between themselves within the corporation through the social mores of the society from which they have sprung up. We have devised corporate governance in the last 10 years based on the Anglo-Saxon model of how the board should interact within itself and with the management. I wonder whether you have any suggestions on how the cultural moorings of Indians can be better played out in the way our corporate governance rules and procedures are currently laid out, so that we can get a more effective form of corporate governance, even if it's not so efficient.
The question is, how are they working together? If they're working well together, then it's fine. What happens when there's conflict? Then who becomes more powerful? And usually it's not either or. You have this impersonal set of rules that are, it's almost as if you have the commandments, you have the king, and you have the prophets. And each one is checking who is following the rules.
Right.
There is a level of suspicion that on his own, the king is perhaps not going to follow the rules, and he must be constantly watched. Now, if I'm the promoter and I have done the business on my own without board and have done a successful business. Now as I grow in size, perforce the rules force me because I need more funds, I need to create a board of directors. Suddenly I see that just because I've got access to more funds, my freedom is being taken away from me. That same freedom that enabled me to grow the business is being taken away from me. And therefore the relationship starts getting soured. If you look at the biblical examples, there are constantly stories of King David trying to do what he wants to do. And he's constantly being warned by the prophets, you cannot do what you want to do. You have to align within the rules. And there is this great tension between the king and the prophet. For example, he has an extramarital affair which is forbidden, and he wants to build a temple which is forbidden. And he's constantly doing things because he wants to fulfill his individual will rather than what is the appropriate conduct within by the commandments and by the law and the voice of God. And that narrative is very strong in the Bible of you cannot be an individual. You have to be subservient to an impersonal entity called the law. Now these are the sources from which the idea of governance has come into India. The idea of it is relatively alien because the focus over here is focus on the king. If the king is an honest man, then things will fall into place. So the education of the kings played a lot of role. But today what we are saying is we want Ram, and to create Ram we will produce a set of rules. Rules don't make Ram.
I'm curious, even the kings in ancient India must have had a council of ministers, ministers that advised the king and also kept the king in check to some extent by offering him the right advice, nudging him constantly in the right direction. Is there a parallel in our scriptures that, albeit draws from the Western model of governance, but Indianizes that?
You see, the king was never kept in check. The council of ministers was there to counsel, to advise the king, but ultimately the king was like what is called a yajman, and he's performing the great sacrifice, a yajna. And he is doing the swaha. All his decisions are the swaha. And what comes from the yajna, whatever comes from the yajna, is the result of his actions, his decisions. So swaha in the ancient days, what is a swaha? You pour things into the fire. Once you throw it out, it doesn't come back. It's your decision. And what comes back to you is the direct result of your decisions. Nobody keeps you in check. So there are ministers and there is the rishi and the pandit, everybody sitting around you, supporting you to do the yajna. But ultimately, in the yajna, who is the yajman? Who is the decision maker? Who takes accountability for the yajna? Is the board taking accountability or the CEO taking accountability? It comes down to that.
In today's day and age, it would be almost impossible to live without a set of rules constantly telling people that, hey, if you're not doing what these rules set out for you to do, then you're doing the wrong thing. How do we leave companies entirely to the governance of an individual? How do we not build in checks and balances through a board? And yet, how do we create equality between the board and that CEO or the promoter or the king?
See, implicit in your questions is that if the rules did not exist, there would be anarchy and chaos.
To some extent.
You see, this is a Western construct. What do I mean by that? The idea that laws create order, and if you remove laws, there is no order and there is chaos, is a Western construct. In the Indian construct, if there were no laws, it's not chaos that exists. Therefore, in the Western mythology, the images of dragons exist. If you read Mesopotamian mythology, you read Greek mythology, there's always this image of dragons which exist. And it is the great hero, the great king, who comes and tames the dragon and creates order with rules. But in the Indian context, if you take away the human being, what exists? If you take away man completely, what exists is nature, prakriti. And what is nature? Nature is not disorganized. Nature is not chaotic. What you have in nature is the instinct of survival. And only the fit survive, and might is right. Now that is what exists in nature. So when I create culture, I'm creating the very opposite. It is not might has right, meek have rights too. So it is about a world where I go out of my way to help the helpless. Now, how do I do that? Will the rules make me do that, or do I genuinely want to do that? If I don't want to help the helpless, if despite being a human being I want to behave like an alpha male, which rule is going to, then the rules will not control me.
In short, your response to Gopal's question is that no, there is no Indian code of governance that can be created, or a code of governance that is contextualized to our conditioning here in India. There is no such thing, because no set of rules can actually help you be a better person.
Let me give you an example of rules in form of a story. You see, when you read the Ramayan, you know, one of the most famous lines in the Ramayan is Raghukula Riti Sada Chali Aayi, Pran Jaya Par Vachan Na Jaye. It's a very famous line. When you read this line, you have to ask yourself the question, when Ram goes to the forest in the Ramayan, is he obeying his father or is he obeying the law? What do you think?
Well, his father's word is the law, so he's obeying both, isn't he?
Look at what the father is saying. Raghukula Riti, that means the law of the clan is more important, which is the Raghu family, the dynasty to which he belongs to. Is it Ram obeying the father or is Ram obeying the law?
Well,
it's a very interesting line if you look at
considering that there is no conflict in obeying either one, because both are saying the same, and the law or the custom of his family or the tradition is to follow what your father says, he is obeying both.
Right. Now let's look at the same narrative, and it continues over time. At the last chapter of the book, the same law says, the king's wife shall be of unblemished reputation.
He followed that as well, didn't he?
Exactly. And so what is the narrative inadvertently saying? Be careful of laws. If you stick to them and don't look at the spirit of the law. Why did laws come into being? It came into being to help the helpless, to move out of the animal desire to dominate, and for the might to have rights. You had laws so that the meek have rights too. But look at this law. An innocent, pregnant woman is being told to leave the forest because the law becomes more important. And Ram is Maryada Purushottam. So too much of alignment to the law. See, Indian scriptures are always wary of laws, because laws seem to be are removed from context, while Indian thought is all about context.
We can't in business create rules that are contextual to every business and its leader and its future.
Yes.
So we need something that's uniform. That's the honest truth of this day and age.
Yes.
Is there anything that is more suited to the Indian way of thinking as opposed to importing what is a Western code of governance and then trying to fit it onto Indian companies and saying, hey, we understand that you guys are not all equal, but the board is supposed to stand up to the CEO and the CEO is supposed to defer to the board, so make it work.
You see, I think this is where the humanity has to be worked on. See, everywhere we are talking about a code transforming people into good people. See, the whole thing is, I need a code to make me good. That it comes down to this one single argument. Give me this law which will make me good. That's a very difficult thing to achieve. We have to ask ourselves, are we working towards creating leaders who know why they are doing what they are doing? These are things that are not even being addressed. We are focusing so much on the law because we have given up on human beings. We're saying human beings don't work. So processes are important, structures are important, laws are important, conducts are important, and you have constitutions being changed every day. You can change Indian constitution 20,000 times. That will not make our politicians honest.
So the answer to Gopal's question is that boards at best can play an advisory role, but they cannot really keep the CEO in check. They cannot stop him from exploiting a loophole if he has decided to, nor can they make him a better person than he actually is.
Yes, absolutely. And you see, in Indian thought, while it will not be there in the rational world, is that for every action there are consequences. If not in this life, then in the next.
Governance is always referred to as the spirit of governance, because like we've said, governance needs to go beyond what the rule book says. It's not just adhering to the rules, it's about taking into account and keeping in mind the interest of all stakeholders, right? So I have a couple of questions that to me seem like governance conflicts, and I want to know what our scriptures have to say about them. Can the end justify the means? Because I think at various points in the Mahabharat, as laid out in your book as well, Krishna violates every rule of war. And yet he does that so as to be able to help the Pandavas win. Can the end justify the means?
You see, look at this. The assumption is if the rules are followed, then good will happen. This is what we are saying, right? If the rules are followed, then good will happen. So rules are almost good. First of all, this very idea is alien to Indian because rules exist in a context. And the same rule in a different context may not apply. For example, you have a rule that says that if you obey the father, you are a good son, you should obey. Now, in the Mahabharat, there is Bhishma, who obeys his father. His father says one day that, he doesn't say it, but implies that he's unhappy because he's fallen in love with a young woman. So the young son, instead of, which is Bhishma, he was called Devavrata then. He discovers that his father has fallen in love with a fisherwoman. And he says that, he goes to the fisherwoman and says, I want you to marry my father. And the woman says that, I won't marry unless my children become kings. And the only way my children become kings is if you give up the throne. And he says, I give up the throne. And then he says that, anyway, what if your children fight my children? And he says that I will never marry again. So the son sacrifices for the father. Now, what seems good in the Ramayan, because the son is sacrificing, in the Mahabharata has a terrible effect, because by that one act he destroys the family tree. Because all children born after that are not born normally, they're born through the intervention of sages and the gods. And what ends up is the Mahabharata, the whole fight for the kingdom. So what appears like a good thing, because the son obeyed the father in the Ramayan, is a terrible thing in the Mahabharata. The same action. So we have to be very careful when we say rules equal to good, because as every good lawyer knows, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law are important. Now, coming to the Mahabharata, when you're talking about ends and means, let's ask ourselves what happens at the end of the Mahabharata war. On one side, you have the Kauravas, and the other side, you have the Pandavas. And let's ask ourselves, who would like this victory? So, at the end of the war, 100 of the Kauravas are killed. Good, the villains are dead. So that must be naturally law. But let's look at the narrative, and this is unfortunately in modern retellings we don't focus. Each and every son of the Pandavas is killed. So you have 5 sons born of Draupadi. So Draupadi has, the villains have been killed, but all her 5 sons are killed. What kind of victory is that? So, well, I have got the kingdom, but your children are dead. And what happens to Krishna, who has made the war? He's cursed that 36 years later, his entire family will be destroyed. So in fact, everybody is losing. So the question is, the story is not about winning. Mahabharata war is about empathy. It comes down to empathy. Remember, when the war is being fought, Krishna goes to Duryodhana and says, I want peace, let's make peace, let's make peace. And Duryodhana says, no, I don't want to have peace. You see, there was an agreement, a contract, that for 13 years, these people who have gambled away the kingdom will go to the forest. When they come back, they will get the kingdom. So it's a very clear contract, right? At the end of that period, when the one part has been filled, the other fellow has to give his end of the bargain.
And
right?
Duryodhana violates the contract or defaults on it.
He defaults, and then Krishna says, okay, fine. And he argues on calendar, he argues on time, he argues that, they didn't live for 12, but I caught them before that, and he keeps arguing technicalities. And finally Krishna says, enough. What about giving them 5 villages? And he says, no. Then he says, okay, how about a house with 5 rooms? And he says, no, not a needle point of territory will I give. Now you see, yahan se, this is where his intention is being released. Till then, he was following the law, he was following the rules, he was well within the rules, right? But his intention was dishonorable, and so he had to be pushed to the corner. And when he was pushed to the corner, what did you have?
It resulted in war, which ended up destroying most people's fortunes,
yes.
right?
But you see, if the war had not been fought, this king would have thrived. A king who doesn't care for anybody else. So what kind of a society would have existed?
But what kind of God do we worship in Krishna when he broke every rule of that war just to ensure that the Pandavas win? I understand that his intent was to restore or to ensure that a king like Duryodhana does not get to continue. But yet, how can the end justify the means?
What is the end of the Mahabharata? Not the war. You see, that is the 12th chapter of the Mahabharata. There are 6 more chapters after this, which again is not part of common translation.
Right. Yeah.
What is the original name of the Mahabharata? The original name of the Mahabharata is called Jaya. Jaya.
As in victory?
Victory. But there is another word for victory in India. It is called Vijaya. Now, why have they given this strange name Jaya to this book? Because you see, the story does not end with the war. There is a bloodshed. Nobody is a winner, as you can see. Krishna says, a king who behaves like an animal, then the society is as good as not existing. So the Kauravas are killed, Pandavas suffers. At the end of 36 years, we are told that the Pandavas die, and the eldest brother, Yudhishthira, who is supposed to have created this wonderful kingdom where all rules are followed and everything, goes to heaven. And when he goes to heaven, he finds over there imagine, he enters heaven. The moment he enters heaven, the first thing he sees are the 100 Kauravas.
In heaven?
In heaven. Now this is called the Svarga Aharonika Parva, the last chapter. And when he goes there, he sees, and remember, while he's walking up the mountain, he's given up everything. He's given up his kingdom, he's given up his wealth, his clothes, his cows, his gold. His wife dies and he doesn't turn around to look at him because they've given up relationships. His brothers die, he doesn't look back. He just keeps walking front. And when he comes to the gates of heaven, he's this great man who's given up everything. And when he enters, what does he see? He sees the Kauravas there. And he's furious. And he says, how can these murderers be kept over there? Where are my brothers? Why should my brothers not be here? Why should my wife not be here? And he starts arguing. And they show the brothers are in hell.
So all the rest of the Pandavas are in hell?
Because in those 36 years, perhaps they were not all that great. We don't know. I mean, there are stories about it, details. For example, Draupadi favored one of the husbands. Bhima was a glutton. And Arjuna was very insecure and conceited. So these kind of...
These were the reasons for which they were banished to hell?
Hell. But the point is not that. The gods ask, why are you so angry, Yudhishthira? And he says the gods are being unfair. Because the villains cannot be in heaven, right? Now imagine, why is Vyasa putting this twist in the tale? Because he wants to communicate something deeper. And he says, you know what, Yudhishthira? You great king, you have given up everything except your anger. For 36 years, you have killed these guys, right? They've been punished. You have ruled their kingdom for 36 years. So you've punished them. So why haven't you forgiven them yet? And if you can't forgive them, if you can't purge your heart of anger, what have you actually given up? Why should heaven be yours?
So he doesn't get a place in heaven?
No, he's being asked that. Because unless you purge your heart of anger and forgiveness, you cannot enter heaven. And that is Jaya. Not victory over others, but victory over yourself. And that will only happen when there is empathy in your heart. Yudhishthira does not display empathy. He is unable to forgive the villain. It's not eternity. They have done the crime, they have paid for it. This is what, remember, while Ramayan talks about the perfect king, Mahabharat talks about the process of creating the perfect king. And the process of perfect king is for the CEOs and the leaders and the managers to ask themselves, why are they doing what they are doing? Is it coming from exploitation? To exploit people and make lots of money and then travel in your BMW? Is that the point of living? Because then you're no different from the lion, the alpha male. In ancient India, you were supposed to sit on the throne, the lion throne, which means you're not supposed to be the lion. You have to outgrow the lion.
You have to conquer the lion.
The lion within you, your desire to be this great alpha male and dominate society. You don't have to be that. It's not about Vijaya, defeating the other alpha males and being wary of them. It is about Jaya, which is conquering the animal inside you, that enables you to not be Duryodhana and say, not a needle point of territory. I will not give an inch in negotiations, because you get this false sense of triumph. It is about discovering that why do kings exist? You don't exist to make money for yourself. You exist to ensure wealth is generated and distributed so that everybody in your kingdom can discover the purpose of life.
So does Yudhishthir get a place in heaven?
Eventually everyone does.
But the rest of the Pandavas, the 4 of them, are in hell.
There are infinite lives. This is just one of their many lives.
Okay, at the end of that life, does he get a place in heaven? I'm
Wait
curious.
for the next episode.
That's my technique. I have one last question on this. I can understand why the Pandavas went to hell. You explained it. Draupadi favored 1 out of 5 husbands. Bhima was a glutton. Arjun was vain. Yudhishthira still held on to his anger. Why in heavens did the Kauravas get to be in heaven, considering that they were no better off?
You see, it's like asking during appraisals that, I don't think he's good enough to get the raise, right? Guys whom you hate get the raise, and guys whom you love don't get the raise. So we decide we know the rules of God.
Well, at least the rules of raises. If not the rules of God.
The best time to meet people is post-appraisal, and everybody imagines who they consider as heroes and who they consider villains, and somehow it never matches that of the management. The management has heroes and villains of their own, and it doesn't match, the upstream and downstream gaze is very different. And everybody believes they know who belongs in heaven and who belongs in hell.
So I'm not saying that the Kauravas belong in hell. I'm curious to know that despite everything that they did, deny the Pandavas their rightful kingdom, be such horrible people, why did they end up going to heaven?
Well, the reason is because the land on which they died was considered to be very auspicious. So it was just luck.
It was just luck.
Good luck. They died on a land which was considered to be holy. That's all. But you see, the fact is, your stay in heaven is not permanent. You see, it's not heaven as, again, this is the problem of the Eastern, it's not heaven with a capital H. It is heaven with a small h, which is
it's not
Swarga.
a destination, it's a stopover
It's a stopover because you will live in heaven for only a limited duration of time. And then you will move on to the next life and the next life. So it is like, you know, Swarga is a place where you go when you have got enough equity. And hell is the place where you go when you have too much debt.
Modern education and training systems ignore the age-old belief that knowledge can never only be given, it must also be taken.
So in the Ramayan, what people don't realize, the first part of the Ramayan is the education of Ram. It's called the Balkand, the child, when he's a child. And we're told that after, when he grows up, he's sent to the ashram of a rishi called Vashisht, where he's trained in the various royal arts, the martial arts. He learns a lot of things. And then after his education, he comes back to the palace as a prince, fully ready, having read everything that a Vashishta had to teach him. And then suddenly one day, there is another rishi who walks in, and his name is Vishwamitra. And Vishwamitra walks in and he says, you know, I have a problem in the forest and I want Ram to come and solve it. And Dashrath says, but Ram is very young. I will give you my army. Use the army to solve the problem. And Vishwamitra insists that Ram come with him because he says, who is going to be king? Who is going to rule? Who has to solve the problems? It is Ram, right? So let him come with me. And he literally drags this young man from the zone of comfort where his father wants to keep him in a very safe place to the zone of discomfort, from the palace into the forest. And the first challenge that Ram faces in his life is of a Rakshashi, a demoness, attacking him called Tataka. And Ram says that, you know, it's a woman and I've been told that you should not harm a woman. Stri Hatya is a great sin, it's a pap.
That's what he's been taught all along.
He's been taught all along.
Right.
And Vishwamitra says, it doesn't matter whether it is a man or a woman. Look at the situation, look at the context, see what the problem is. And right now the problem is this lady and you have to kill her. So he raises his weapons and kills Tataka.
Quite against all his training, which is don't raise, you know, no violence against
no violence.
women.
And it's, in a way, it's almost, it's a talk, one can look at it as equality, where when you're looking at a situation, don't get bogged down by theoretical rules and conduct. Just look at the situation, find the problem, and take the decision that you have to take. And it's a ruthless one. So Ram has to shoot. The first act he does is he's told by his teacher, shoot Tataka, and he kills Tataka. But the story doesn't end there. Then he goes on a journey, and it's an interesting journey where
with Vishwamitra.
With Vishwamitra. And Vishwamitra takes him to another spot. And at that point, he comes across a stone, and he's told the stone is one of Ahalya. And she has had an extramarital affair, and then Vishwamitra looks at Ram and says,
so she's been, turned into a stone because she had an extramarital affair. That's her punishment.
It's a punishment. And he says, liberate her from this punishment. Liberate her, touch her with your feet, and she will break free from the stone, the cursed life that she's leading. Liberate her, uddhar karo uska. So what you have is an extreme, two extreme situation. On one side, you have Tataka, who has to be killed. So it's an act of ruthlessness.
And
on the other side, it's of upliftment, of liberation.
Of compassion as well.
Of compassion, of extreme compassion. So you move from being ruthless to being compassionate. And these are the two extreme decision-making behaviors that a king has to demonstrate. Sometimes he has to be ruthless, and sometimes he has to be compassionate. And a wise king knows what to do when. And this is a shift from the theoretical background that he was in, from Vashishta to Vishwamitra. And Vishwamitra, as if you read the scriptures, was once a king. So he knows the practical problems Ram will face when he's to live in society. And in a way, he's imparting knowledge that this is what you're going to do. There will be times when you'll have to be ruthless, and there'll be times you have to be compassionate. And when you know when to be ruthless and when to be compassionate, you will be a great king.
Okay, so to deviate a little bit from the broader theme of education and training and development, how do you know when to be compassionate and when to be ruthless? I mean, does the story narrate why Vishwamitra suggested that in the first case, Ram kill the woman, and in the second case, be compassionate and liberate her from her punishment?
See, there is no, I can't give there's no such kind of a toolkit or a template, you know. We are basically,
right. I'm
that's
just
what
curious to know why.
You know, but
why, ruthlessness on one end and compassion on the other?
You see, here at one place, in one side, you're saying that if I don't take that decision, then the forest will be destroyed. The
community will
be destroyed. So it is violence happening at one side, and the only way to stop it is by being ruthless over it, because there seems to be no other method to handle that.
Okay.
On the other side, it is that if you let it go, then there is no hope for people. That means if someone has made a mistake in their life, it means that you'll never forgive them. Imagine living in a society where there's no forgiveness. So on one side there is almost brutal punishment. On the other side, there's forgiveness. And so there's always hope being given. But not only hope. If there was only hope, then I can get away with everything. So there is a balance of the two. So there is what is called dandaniti, the stick. And the other side is, well, not quite the carrot, but
I get what you mean. It's almost the carrot in terms of hope. That there is forgiveness if you do commit mistakes, right?
Because, yes, there is punishment, but it's not forever.
Okay. I'm curious, why did Vishwamitra not take these decisions himself and insist that Ram has to do this, himself, as opposed to Vishwamitra, who you pointed out was also a king at one time, could have easily killed Tataka and easily released Ahalya, right?
Yes. You see, but the point, it's an interesting point, because you see, Vishwamitra has stopped being king. Now he's moved to the next stage of his life. He's moved to a stage where he wants to go to the next level, which means that all his royal pursuits has to be managed by someone else. So in a way, it's passing on. It's passing on the baton to the next generation. Okay. You see, it's the next generation now has to take care of the world. He can't be there all the time. So it's about the older generation saying that, okay, we have done what we had to do. We learned, we made mistakes, we have figured out things. Now we're passing it on to the next generation. The next generation will now be capable. So one can call it, it's a capability building exercise. So that then Vishwamitra can move on.
So for every Ram, you have to have a Vishwamitra, otherwise Ram would not have existed.
Absolutely.
From a corporate or an organization or an enterprise perspective, that is almost the one most important thing that enterprises are constantly working to achieve, that the people who are currently in positions of power train and impart their knowledge and their understanding to those who are likely to then become their successors, so to speak. And that exchange of information, knowledge, experience is not almost always perfect, right?
If you say the purpose of an organization is growth, the growth being the primary word, and how do I grow? Now, normally growth is seen purely in economic terms, in terms of growth of Lakshmi. So my salary has to increase, my the top line, bottom line at a company level, at an individual level, my salary, my perks, my remuneration has to increase. But let's take another currency which also exists in India. Lakshmi is not the only currency. The other currency is Saraswati, knowledge. Right. So every person who walks into an organization is suddenly exposed to a whole load of knowledge as he does his work. Now he says, I want to go to the next level. What is going to the next level mean? When you look at it from a mythological perspective, we are saying that, you know what, the role that I'm performing, I have done the best I can, I have lived it. Now I want to take up a new role. In a way, I have to shed the old role and take up a new role. So in a way, the old role, the shedding of the old role can be equated with death. So when you die in India, you cross a river called the Vaitarani.
Right.
So when I'm saying, you know what, I've been a good executive, so I die as an executive so that I can be reborn as a manager. But why should I be allowed to move on to the other shore unless I have created a replacement for myself? Because otherwise you're indispensable. The word uses pitrarin, it's an obligation. Okay. Just as you were made an executive by someone else, you shall make someone else an executive before moving on to the next role as manager. So if you look at an organizational hierarchy, it's really one generation after another generation, and each generation is obliged to the previous generation and to the next generation. So there is a telescoping of ambitions across generations, which one is trying to achieve. And this is how the ashrama system came into being. In ancient India, they said that, okay, you're going to live for 100 years. And they said, let's divide your life into 4 phases. And the first phase is when you're a student.
Right.
The next phase, you're a householder. Third phase, you are retired. And the fourth phase, you're a renunciant.
Right.
You're a sannyasi. Now, look at it metaphorically. What it says in the first phase, you gain Saraswati. In the next phase, you use the knowledge of Saraswati that you've got to gain Lakshmi. Now, having done the householder's life, what do you mean by retirement? Because that's 25 years, because it's divided into 4 equal phases. What do you do actually in the retirement? It's not actually, retirement doesn't mean walking away from everything. It means passing on the Saraswati that you have gained to the next generation. And only then, renunciation is moving to whatever you want to do.
Right.
So it's kind of a cyclical process which is happening. So in this stage, retirement stage, I'm talking to the previous generation, preparing them. And so one generation is growing. So I give Saraswati and move on to the next level. So who grows? The new trainee is growing. And so am I growing, because I can go on now to take the next position. And so there is like a perfect wave that is happening, where Saraswati is being given, Saraswati is being taken. Saraswati is being given, and so is Lakshmi being generated. So there is growth at an intellectual level as well as at an economic level. And that is what organizations should aspire for. I mean, the whole idea of creating a separate training department is absurd. Because who has the knowledge? The person in the field has the knowledge, not the person, someone sitting in the classroom. Coaching is intrinsic to growth. And that's what the Vishwamitra story in a way says, that he has been a king, he has been a great king called Kaushika. Vishwamitra, friend of the world. That's the meaning of the name. So he's saying that, I will pass on whatever I have learned to this young, promising prince called Ram, and then move on.
But not all of us can be Vishwamitras. You call this a perfect wave. But the thing about corporate power or power in the workplace is that the more you know, the more power you have, the more indispensable you are, or the less dispensable you are.
Yes.
And therefore, the incentive to pass this on to successive generations and empower them as well is very, very low, right? Because then it makes me less important.
Yes, absolutely. See, the whole idea is we think knowledge is power.
Right.
So I don't want to give it. The reason I give it away is because in the process of giving it away, I learn many more things.
Okay.
So it's the Saraswati is this wonderful, unlike Lakshmi. If I have 1 rupee coin and I have to give, and you have 1 rupee coin, and we exchange 1 rupee coin, both of us are still left with 1 rupee coin. But if I have an idea and you have an idea and we exchange 2 ideas, we both have 2 ideas. So the wonderful thing about Saraswati is that
It doubles.
It doubles.
Right.
So if I want to increase my understanding of Saraswati, the best way to improve my understanding of any subject is to teach. Because also what happens is, in the process I figure out human dynamics. We figure out, why does a person not want to study? Because it's so obvious, right? This is the way you negotiate. And you'll realize that the person in front of you is not learning. The teacher, by observing the student and his resistance to learning, figures out human dynamics. He understands why a person, nobody's obliged to learn, how difficult it is to learn. And so you have to work very hard to make the subject attractive.
So it is incumbent upon the teacher to sort of find ways to help the student learn, as much as it is incumbent on the student to find ways to learn.
Let me rephrase this slightly. What I'll say is that in the process of giving Saraswati, I figure out the art of becoming attractive.
Okay.
Because I focus on creating the honey, and the students will come like bees. The focus is on creating the honey and not in attracting the bees. The bees will come. Now, that is the growth that I get when I'm passing on my knowledge to the other. So you gain and I gain. You gain some knowledge, you get the data, but I get the wisdom. I always notice something, whenever the school bell rings, have you seen how, what is the first thing that you hear when the school bell rings?
A great amount of cheer, joy, and children running out.
Yeah, children running out, because it's almost like, it's the cry of the domesticated beast. He's been tied and fettered in the classroom, and suddenly he's being liberated. So he wants you to run away from school. This is the education system we have created. So even a training program in a corporate world, you're dying for the lunch break and the coffee break because you just can't keep your eyes open, because you are being pushed into this this space where they are going to domesticate you using various methods, like 9:30 to 10:30 you learn this, and 10:30 and as if your brain is going to sort of get it. What is attention is not given to the simple fact that is the student motivated willingly to enter the school? No. So he has to be pushed in, broken inside, and it's almost violent, the process of education and training. Now let's look at a different method. Let's look at the Indian method of training, and the Vikram and Vetal story, which is a folk tale, explains this in a very powerful way. Now, Vikramaditya was a great king, and one day a sorcerer came to him and said, go to a cremation ground and find me a Vetal, a ghost. And Vikramaditya said, of course, whatever you want I shall give, because being a great king, he was willing to give anything to anybody who came to him. So he goes to the crematorium to find the ghost, and the instruction is that when there is a banyan tree and the ghost hangs upside down, and you have to pull it down and carry it on your shoulders, but never speak to it. If you open your mouth and speak to the ghost will fly away.
And then you'll have to go back and
you have to go back and collect him.
Okay.
Now, so he goes to the crematorium, finds the ghost hanging upside down, pulls him down, puts him on his shoulder, walks back. Now, the ghost doesn't want to be caught. So the ghost tries everything in his power to make Vikramaditya speak. He chats him up, asks him questions, and Vikramaditya refuses to speak. Finally, the Vetal comes up with an idea. He says, let me tell you a story. And at the end of the story, I'll ask you a question. If you know the answer to the question, speak. If you know the answer to the question and do not speak, your head will burst into 1,000 pieces. But if you don't know the answer, keep quiet. It's perfectly fine. You know, this is what we call the case study method.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Harvard Business School has put it to use for many, many years now, very successfully, right?
Yeah. So, I guess it is validated once it happens in Harvard.
All right. Ouch. Okay.
So, the Vetal keeps asking questions, and Vikramaditya, being a very wise king, is able to answer all the questions. So for 24 times the stories are told, 24 times the questions are asked, and 24 times the answer is given, and the Vetal flies back, much to the exasperation of Vikramaditya.
Who has to go back and recollect him and then go through the whole process of storytelling. And
again and again.
Right.
It's a cyclical, boring thing. You know, it's like that sales cycle every month and the business plan cycle every month. It's horrible. You know, you want a liberation from that, don't you?
Right.
And then finally, the 25th time, Vikramaditya is unable to answer the question.
He genuinely doesn't know the answer, because if he knew it, his head would have burst into 1,000 pieces.
And so he heaves a sigh of relief. He says, there, now I have got the ghost and I'll take him back to the sorcerer. And the ghost laughs, you know, the typical Hindi film laughs. And he says, what a foolish man you are. Do you realize every time you answered the question, you were saving your own life? So long as you can answer the question, you were saving your life. The fact that you can't answer the question means now you are in trouble. Because you see, the moment you'll take me to the sorcerer is going to bottle me and turn me into a genie, and I'll be the very powerful genie. And what is the first thing I will be asked to do?
Is to kill you as the king.
Is to kill you.
Right.
And so all the time when you were problem solving and you were getting irritated by that, you didn't realize that that is the only reason you are king. You exist to answer questions. You only matter when you solve problems. So you should welcome problems rather than saying, oh, I don't want problems in life. Because then what is the use of a king?
It's a beautiful metaphor, because the day the problems go away, your utility as a king reduces to nothing, right?
Nothing. But you see, the smashana bhumi, or the cremation ground where the ghost exists, is the training room. No business happens over there. Nothing happens. So it's a cremation ground. And the trainer or the facilitator or the guru, whoever you want to call it, is the Vetal. He has nothing to gain by the training. He's paid for it anyway, whether it's good training or bad training. Who gains from the training session? It's the participants. So it's the Vikramaditya who has to come to the Smashana Bhumi. The Vetal won't come to Vikramaditya. So in ancient India, the teachers never went to the students. You didn't have advertisements for colleges and schools.
Right.
If you want to study, come. If you don't want to study, don't come. Who loses? There's this Chinese proverb, like you keep hearing this all the time. You keep hearing don't give a man a fish.
Teach him how to fish.
Teach him how to fish. The Indian method would be very different. They would say, no, don't give a man a fish. Don't teach him how to fish either, but inspire him to discover his own method of fishing, because then it's his. That's the teacher's job. And in inspiring the student, he grows himself. This is Saraswati Dan.
Can everything be measured? Is all measurement accurate? Is it true that if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it? Are we headed for measurement overkill? Is that why in mythology the god of accounting or measurement is none other than Yama, the god of death?
But the truth of our modern lives is that everything has to be measured, whether it's our personal ambition, personal happiness, or our professional output and therefore professional success. How do you escape measurement?
You see, when you use the word measurement, we are trying to create an objective reality. One that we all can agree is the reality. But there is another reality that exists, which is the subjective reality, the personal reality. Let me explain this in the form of a story. You see, one day, Narad came to Mount Kailas and with a mango. And he said, this mango is for the one who runs fastest, who goes 3 times around the world the fastest. And so Ganesha, 2 brothers, Ganesha and Kartikeya, decided that we will go for the race. So Kartikeya immediately leapt on a peacock and flew around the world 3 times. So he went around the world 3 times on his peacock. And Ganesha sat right in the center, doing nothing. He just sat there, waiting, while his brother flew around 3 times, once, twice. And just when his brother was about to complete the 3rd round, Ganesha got up and just went around his parents once, twice, thrice, and says, I won. And Kartikeya says, how come? And Ganesha says, you went around the world. I went around my world. What matters more? This is the difference between objective and subjective reality.
Sure.
So Kartikeya represents objective reality in this narrative, and Ganesha represents subjective reality. And think about it, both matter. So when we are talking about measurements, we focus only on one half of the truth, the objective reality. We have completely ignored the other half of the truth, which is subjective reality, which is gut feel, which is qualitative, which cannot be measured. It's about taste, it is about instinct, it is about intuition, which cannot be measured. And some of the greatest success stories in the world are based not on objective reality, but on the subjective realities of imagination.
But everything today in the world is driven towards measuring everything, whether it's objective or subjective.
Yes.
Is your argument then that some things just cannot be measured?
No, some things cannot be measured. Emotions cannot be measured.
But you can grade them. Are you very happy? Are you happy? Are you very, very happy? There is some form of measurement.
Let me tell you the danger of the story of what happens when you try to measure everything. You've heard the tragedy of King Lear, the Shakespeare's play. It is about the tragedy of a king who tried to measure the love of his daughters.
Right.
This play is based on a German folk tale, The Goose Girl, which of course all Indians will claim has its origins in India. And the story is of a father who asks his daughters, how much do you love me? And the eldest daughter says, I love you as much as sugar. And the youngest daughter says, I love you as much as salt. And in the father's mind, sugar had a higher score, and so he said the elder daughter loves me more and the younger daughter does not love me enough, and therefore he rejects the younger daughter. And yet from a younger daughter's perspective, she was trying to say how much she loved him, because you cannot eat anything unless it contains salt. He was everything to her. So it's also the perception. You see, the measuring scale may be objective, but the measurer is not, nor is the person who is reading the measurement. So if I took a measuring scale, on one side is a person who measures, and the other side is a person who is reading the measurement. They're
Right.
2 people. each one coming to the table with their respective bias, with their prejudices. We are completely ignoring this, and we assume that if an auditor comes into the picture, he will figure out the truth.
Because he is more objective.
And the auditor is a human being too, with his own prejudices, with his own bias, with his own power games coming to the table. And we don't realize that what the truth that emerges is not just what the measuring scale tells us, but a combination of the measuring scale as well as the subjective realities of the person who measures, the person who is reading the measurement, and then the auditor in between. And so you're getting a very warped reality.
But there is no solution to this, right, Devdutt? Because we have to measure in the modern world. In large organizations, if you want to reward, before you reward, you have to understand how good the performance is. So therefore, you measure the performance. A measurement is embedded in almost every stage of how the individual performs in an organization, how a team performs, how the organization itself performs for shareholders, for stakeholders, etc.
Yes.
So how do you get away from measurement whilst fully acknowledging that part of it is subjective and part of it is objective?
See, we are trying to create a world which is 100% objective, and therefore we are assuming that we'll create a fair world. This is the promised land where everything is 100% objective and we'll create a fair world. And that is where this is the goalpost. I want to create this objective world and a fair world. But if we recognize that no matter how hard we try, we'll only be 50% objective, and therefore all our measurements will have flaws in them, then I'm closer to reality. I'm comfortable accepting that the balance sheet is not the truth. The CV which comes to me is not the truth. It is an indicator of the truth, but not the whole truth. That recognition is sometimes missing because what I'm saying is about over-reliance on measurement. It has become today only about measurement when it should be also about measurement. This shift, I mean, let me give you an example of subjectivity. You have the story of a king called Mahabharat, who said that he will give anybody whatever they want. And suddenly one day a dwarf comes in front of him, and the dwarf says, give me 3 paces of land. And Mahabharat says, yes, take 3 paces of land. So 1, 2, 3. And the moment he says, take 3 paces of land, this dwarf turns into a giant and takes these gigantic paces. With 2 paces of land, he covers the heaven and earth. And then he has no place to put his 3rd foot. And he says, where should I put it? And Mahabharat says, put it on my head. And he's crushed and shoved under the earth. The story talks about subjectivity of measurement. What I think is 3 paces and what the other person thinks is 3 paces is very different. So the person who created the measuring scale and the person who is using the measuring scale are looking at very differently. And that is where conflicts emerge. We would like there to be this one absolute measurement scale, but everybody's reference point is different. To the point that in Indian mythology, and not in philosophy, you see the word measure is based on a phrase called ma, from where comes mapdand. From this word also come not just mapdand, which is the measuring scale, but also the word maya, which is delusion. What one is basically told is be careful of measurements.
I get the conversation about not only measurement, but also measurement, right? I get that. But how do you propose that we do away with a large amount of the measurement that currently exists in the system? We can maybe do away with it when we're small organizations, right? 5, 10, 15 people, you can make the measurement more subjective, less objective, bring in the human element, human interaction, one-on-one, all of that. When you're dealing with large organizations, when you're dealing with organizations that employ 50,000, 1 lakh, 2 lakh, 3 lakh, 4 lakh people, then some part of that measurement does have to get systemized.
Yes.
Because that's the only way, and standardized, because that's the only way you can measure at that scale.
Yes, you can. But you see, big or small, organizations are about people. And every organization is built on teams. It's a simple HR practice that a person should not have more than 5 or 6 people reporting to them. So ultimately, it's about 5 or 6 people, teams built up. So large organizations, just the same 5, like a fractal, like a simple cellular structure.
Right?
It's pyramidal,
yeah, I
right?
get that. Yeah.
And if that is so you have these little teams over here.
That are all reporting into other little teams. Yeah,
so now just magnify one of these teams, and what you have is a measurement of these 5 people by the boss. Now, the measurement, if you admit that is 50% I can measure, the quantitative part you can measure, but the qualitative part cannot be measured, and I give 50% bias to the leader. The leader is biased. No matter how many auditors you get in, just admit that he is biased, which means that now I have to work on him to strip him of bias, to bring in more integrity in his behavior. So which means it is not just about measurement, but it is also about investing in people. Rather than investing energy in ensuring that there is integrity in the manager whose subjective call is good enough, we'd say, you know what, it's too much of energy being wasted on investing in people. So let me invest on a system. System will let me, you see, when you're talking about a subjective measurement, you're saying, I want somebody to pay attention to the human beings inside. Process is about removing attention. Because then I don't have to waste energy in giving attention. Attention is about relationships. It's about people having integrity. But I can't guarantee integrity. What I have with a process and a system and a method is where I'm saying that, you know, I don't have to give attention and I will come to the truth.
I'm not even saying that, but look at this. A, I have a large number of people. B, you already yourself have pointed out that measurement is subjective, right?
Yes.
And therefore, when you have a human being measuring, that human being may come to the table with his or her own prejudices and therefore be measuring the other person's performance output, you know, through the lens of that prejudice, right?
Yes.
So maybe a system, A, not only allows me to deal with a larger number of people, B, also to some extent standardizes the communication and therefore eliminates to some degree the prejudice that a human being may bring in. Yes. I'm not saying systems are perfect. Human beings are not perfect either.
Today, the culture is becoming about let's replace human beings with systems. That seems to be the mindset. The discourse is measurement, objective measurement is all that I need. Subjectivity is being withdrawn. Attention is being withdrawn. What I'm saying is, dono chahiye. So we're moving to also measurement, not only measurement. That's the shift which I'm asking for.
That results in uncertainty.
That will result in uncertainty.
How do you get away from that? Because as organizations, everything is driven towards certainty. What are you going to earn next quarter? What are you going to earn next year? How are your people going to perform? Do you have enough people on the bench? Everything is driven towards certainty, towards creating certainty through business process.
We can measure only some things, but the universe is infinite. Measurement is finite. Possibilities are infinite. But measurement will always be finite. This inability to recognize that, I mean, the entrepreneurs, talk to entrepreneurs, did they create the business based on measurement? Usually they use measurement to validate their gut feel. The gut feel is Kama, the god of desire, the god of lust, the god of instinct. Only when Kama, that is the god of birth, then comes the god of death, Yama, the god of measurement. So measurement comes second, gut comes first. This one validates him. But if over-reliance on Kama cannot work. He's irresponsible. He holds a bow in his hand and just shoots in all the places. You have to restrain him. So he holds in his hand a lasso to restrain him. Too much of restraint and death will happen. Too much of
Karma
and there will be complete chaos. So the question is, how do you balance? And that's where the human element is critical. When we talk about systems and process extremely, we are just saying, can we make do without human beings? And that's a very dangerous thought to happen, because what are organizations for if not about people?
How do you measure happiness?
First, let's define happiness. We have done this in a previous episode, but it is LSD. That is Lakshmi, Saraswati, Durga. L represents material wealth, S represents intellectual, and D represents emotions. What can you measure is L. This is measurable.
Right.
S is partially measurable, and D is not measurable at all.
Right.
So happiness is a combination of some things that can be measured and some things which is wealth.
Some things that can partially be measured, which is intellect or knowledge.
Knowledge, like your training programs, your qualifications that you've got. But what cannot be measured is the emotional quotient. You do try, but you will never, I mean, how do you measure who needs attention and who doesn't need attention? And you know, sometimes happiness is a function of how much attention you get.
Right.
So once you recognize that happiness is a combination of measurable and not measurable, and also what I consider how much money is good enough for me and how much money is good enough for you.
I was just going to bring that. Even there is this subjective element of, you know, how much wealth is enough, right?
And how much wealth is enough is, I mean, should a CEO get 1 crore, 2 crores, 5 crores, 10 crores? Let's check out. Let's find out what is the right measurement for all CEOs. And everybody will say, you know, the measuring scale for me is different from the measuring scale for you. Because see, I am different. And you see, since every human being is unique, everybody has their own unique measurement scale, and that's what Ganesha was trying to tell us. One day, Indra wanted to measure how great he was, and he wanted proof, he wanted to show the world how great he was, which means he wanted something tangible and objective. So he called Vishwakarma, his architect, and said, build a palace for me. And Vishwakarma built a palace of gold for him. And Indra looked at it and said, it is good, but not good enough for me. So build me another palace which will measure my true worth. And that is not good what you have done right now. So Vishwakarma builds another palace, and this time he builds a palace of jewels laden with diamonds and pearls. And Indra looks at this great palace and says, well, this is also good, but not good enough for me. So in both cases, he's saying, the measurement of what you have measured is not quite right.
I measure it very differently, and therefore I want something grander.
Right. And Vishwakarma gets exasperated, and he goes to Vishnu. And Vishnu comes to Indra in the form of a little boy and says, I've heard that you've built a great palace. I want to see this great palace. And Indra says, come, I'll show you. And he shows him the palace of gold, and he shows him the palace of jewels, and says, well, these are good palaces, but they're not as good as I am. And the boy looks at these two palaces and says, well, they're very good, but they're not as good as the palaces of the other Indras I have met. So you see, comparison is being drawn. A reference point is being asked for.
Who are the other Indras?
And who are they? And he says, oh, you thought you were the only Indra? There are as many Indras in this world as there are grains of sand in a beach. Each one assuming that he's great, and each one building a palace of his own. So I have seen palaces which are bigger than yours, and palaces which are smaller than yours. And each one is aspiring for the next palace. And the scale is of infinity. And your ambition is infinite. And your self-imagination is infinite. And you can never measure infinity.
So in what context are we trying to measure all the daily things that we end up measuring?
Because every measurement depends on a reference point. Right. And your reference point and my reference point may be very different. And people try to come up with objective realities. That, the maid servant can make do with no holidays. But the CEO needs a weekend off. Decide which measurement is okay.
It marks civilization's earliest attempt at manufacturing and first example of property. But the clay pot also signifies man's contract with the environment, that all human creation is based on the destruction of nature.
You see, the most interesting story in the Vishnu Puran, in fact the first story of the Vishnu Puran, is about how organizations are created and why organizations grow. And it begins with the story of a fish. You see, Vishnu takes many avatars, as we know, many forms, and the first incarnation is of a fish. And it is always interesting as to why was it a fish, why was it not a tadpole, or why was it not a butterfly, why is it a fish? And then you think of the word Matsya Nyaya, a law of the fishes, which is basically jungle law, might is right. And the story begins with this little tiny fish approaching Manu, and Manu being the ancestor of mankind, Manava, Manu, and asking Manu that, save me from the big fish. So he's being told, save me from the big fish. Now, in nature, nobody will save the small fish from the big fish.
Right.
That's the natural law. The predator and the prey have a relationship. But when humans appear on the scene, we say, you know what, we will not submit to the law of nature. We will help the helpless.
Right.
We will create a world where the meek have rights, which is basically culture. So that is exactly what Manu does when he picks up the small fish in the palm of his hand and takes him out of the sea. So basically disrupting nature. In a way, he's disrupting the law of nature, and then takes him and puts him in a pot and says, you'll be safe here. So in a way, the pot represents the organization where the fish has been placed, and here it is safe now. So there's a separation between the sea, the water in the sea, which is nature, and water in the pot, which is culture.
Got it.
And this demands utilization of resources because the water, the fish, the earth, the pot, clay has not come from a vacuum, it has come from nature.
Right.
Then the fish increases in size.
It grows bigger.
It grows bigger, which means it needs more water, it needs a bigger pot, and so a larger pot has to be designed.
So Manu builds a larger pot for the fish.
And shifts him from the small pot to the big pot, and that is growth. And that's why organizations grow. And as organizations grow, they will demand more of the natural resources.
Right.
It's just natural. This is the way it is going to be.
And so the fish continues to grow and grow?
And as organizations continue to grow and grow, and demanding more and more from nature.
I get that, but is it also not implicit in our scriptures? And this is something that we learn instinctively, right? That all creation is accompanied with destruction.
Yes.
I mean, if we were to believe the broad theory that everything in the world is just energy,
yes,
and it's all about the transfer of energy from one form of matter to another form of matter, all creation is almost always accompanied by destruction.
Yes.
And that is implicitly accepted in our scriptures, isn't it?
Yes. You see, let's look at the image of Durga. When you go to Durga Pandala in Calcutta during Durga Puja, Dasara, what do you see? An image of a mother goddess, and she's slaughtering a buffalo. Now, a very simple answer is that buffalo bad, God is good, good killing bad. But it also means that in order to feed her children, she is taking life. She's taking life of something or the other, so that life feeds on life. So in a way, the mother goddess is saying, in order to feed my children, something has to die. So the forest has to be destroyed so that the field can be created. The river has to be destroyed so that canals can be created. The mountain has to be destroyed so that minerals can be created. And that is the mother goddess violently. It's a very violent form. Blood is flowing. That's the idea of sacrifice. A reminder that for everything that you have created in society, remember, something has died. So ask yourself, why are you creating what you are creating? Why are you creating the organization? Why do you want to grow? Because every time you create an organization or you create growth, you are going to feed on nature. Is it worth it? If not, don't do it. But if you can, be aware that something will always die.
Is the sanction also implicit? I mean, are the scriptures or is mythology implicitly giving you the sanction to destroy nature so as to be able to build culture?
You see, mythology, as I have said repeatedly, is not prescriptive.
Right.
Mythology is reflective, which means it tells you what you are doing in the form of a narrative. So, for example, the Mahabharat, Yudhishthira tells Krishna that I want to build a city.
This is after he wins the war.
The story happens that Yudhishthira goes to his uncle and says that I want my share of the property, because there's a lot of conflict between the two cousins. So finally he said, let's just divide the property and that'll be good that way. So what he does is, the uncle gives him the forest, a forest called Khandavprastha. He says, take this. Now Yudhishthira says, I want to build a city in the forest. What will I do with the forest? I want to turn it into a city, a kingdom. And so he talks to his friend Krishna, and Krishna says, burn the forest. Now think about it. You've been given a forest, and the first thing you're being told, burn the forest. And what will happen when you burn the forest? All the animals, the birds,
you're killing the ecosystem.
They're destroying the entire ecosystem. And Krishna says, if you don't destroy the forest, how will you create the field? How will you feed your people? So in effect, the story tells that the king who wants a kingdom must take responsibility for the fact that in order to build his kingdom, in order to feed his people, he's going to destroy an ecosystem. And the story continues because we are told that there were serpents who lived in that forest, in the Khandavaprastha. This Khandavaprastha, which is inhabited by serpents, many other animals, including the serpents. So when you set it aflame, they burn the forest. All the animals are killed, including the serpents.
Right.
And then the serpents escape. A couple of serpents escape. And forever, there is a feud between the Pandavas on one side, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and the serpents. And in fact, the Mahabharat story begins with this great sacrifice, where a descendant of the Pandavas wants to kill the serpents because the serpents are killing his relatives. And he thinks that the serpents are the villains. And then the storyteller comes in and says, wait a minute, before you declare the serpents villains, please know what your ancestors did to the serpents. How their kingdom was destroyed by this fire in order to establish the city of Indraprastha. So implicit in the narrative is how conflicts are created. Because in order to build your organization, you're going to destroy nature. When you destroy nature, you destroy an ecosystem. That means you're taking away the livelihood of others. So if they exist, there will be conflict between those who have been stripped of it and the organization. So conflict is implicit in culture.
I understand that conflict is part of creating culture and that it's embedded in culture, but the question that it leaves us with, and the question we're grappling with today as well in modern day, is how much is too much? We're all seeing the consequences of over-exploiting the environment.
Yes.
Or taking away from nature. And it's ironic because we are not the perpetrators of this crime,
Yes.
and yet we're paying for it. So how much is too much? And why can't the consequences of actions be more immediate? And therefore, previous generations would have paid for the kind of damage that they did to the environment, as opposed to us having to pay.
Yeah. You see, it depends on the line of sight that you have. In a previous episode, I had talked about Garuda Drishti, the long sight, and Sarpa Drishti, which is short sight. And we spoke about how dangerous it is when a leader only has short sight and does not have long sight. What do we mean by long sight? Every action that we do is having repercussions over generations. But if my focus is on this quarter's profit, then I really don't care about the long-term implications of my actions. I'm so focused on the short term that I've forgotten the long term. Now, what happens at a very selfish level is that I say that I don't have to pay the price. I'm the CEO, I make my money and I move on, and the next CEO will suffer the consequences of my actions. This applies at a larger scale. So generation level, one generation says, we will do what we want, and the next generation is to pay for it. And therefore, this whole mythological idea that a child inherits the sins of his father. How much do we care for the next generation? In fact, it's not just about caring for the next generation. How much do we care for people who don't immediately around us? There's this strange phrase, not in my backyard, which basically says, I'll dump things so long as it doesn't affect me. But as we talk about a shrinking global village,
everything is in your backyard.
And now you're going to pay the price for it, because the same technology that enabled you to shrink is now going to get the serpents back.
You said that Krishna gave his sanction for the burning down of the forest in order to create a city, because he said, how do you create a city if you don't burn down the forest?
Yes.
It brings me back to the question that I asked you. How much is too much? How many forests can you burn down to continuously create cities? I almost know the answer to that. Yes. I understand that there has to be a balance between development and the environment. But is there any prescribed how much is too much?
Let's see it in the form of story. The same, Krishna is Vishnu, and Vishnu's first avatar was of a fish. And that's how we began the story of how organizations are created and how cultures grow.
And the fish is in a pot, and as the fish keeps growing, the pot keeps growing bigger to accommodate the fish.
And the story is very interesting after that, because it starts getting blurry. The fish starts getting larger and larger. It becomes so large that pots are not enough to accommodate it. So it is shifted to a pond, and then it is shifted to a lake. Then it is Manu shifts him to the river, and finally shifts him to the sea. And the next thing that we hear is pralay happens, doomsday. Because you see, what happens is the fish is so big that even the sea is not enough to accommodate it. So the rains have to come to fill the sea and to expand the sea so that it can accommodate the fish. And so as the sea starts to expand, it starts creeping over the land gets flooded, and Manu's land starts to get flooded, and he runs on top of the mountain, Mount Meru, and he's sitting on top of the mountain, and wondering what is happening, what has gone wrong, because wasn't he being very kind and gentle, and he was to try to give the fish more and more resources. You see, at no point did he ask, is that why can't the fish be content with the water in the pot? You are constantly wanting more and more. What is being reined in? Nature's resources are finite. But human desire is infinite. What was never asked is at a particular point, the small fish has become a big fish and can fend for itself. That Manu didn't think. So the compassion which created the pot, when taken to an extreme, becomes his own destruction. Because he becomes so compassionate that he forgets to see the fish can fend for itself. And that's when need becomes greed, and the line between need and greed starts to blur. We don't talk about this. We talk about moral bankruptcy of corporations. It is not that the corporations which are morally bankrupt. It is also the shareholder which is demanding more and more in every quarter. It is the customer who's saying that, listen, I do care for the environment, but I'm not going to give up my car. And you know what? I will not give up my car. But you know, the third world countries, why do they need cars? They should be happy with bullock carts. So I don't want, you see this conflict between I want profit, but I also want my nature to be secure. It can't work both ways.
That's not possible.
That's not possible. Something has to give. So if you're not willing to give up your infinite desire, then the finite nature will take over. And pralay, what is the worst that will happen? 50% of the human population. Nature will always prevail in the end.
So the end is scripted in our scriptures,
It's scriptures.
so to speak.
The first story of Vishnu Puran talks about the creation of organization as well as the destruction of an organization. And the balance, the word given is dharma. And as we have repeatedly talked about dharma, is about look at the other.
Right.
There is no such thing as your backyard. Everything is your backyard. That shift will happen, then dharma will happen. When I realize that where from comes the problem, whether it's an oil spill or Naxalites fighting, where are they coming from? They're coming from some activity that I'm doing. This is my karma. My actions are leading to this reaction. Do I take responsibility for it or think it's the devil's work? It's about taking responsibility for creating the mess that we have done. And the only way to handle it is not by punishing the serpent. It is by taking responsibility for our infinite greed.
So is there any sort of PS in the book that tells you what happens after pralay?
A rebirth happens. The new organizations are created. And the new world order starts, and hopefully a second chance is given. And even if you fail again, you see,
so the same thing
will happen again.
So the end is foretold.
The end is foretold.
Isn't that almost a disincentive to be environment conscious? Because you know that eventually, like organizations, like people, everything is going to come to an end. Now, whether it comes to an end tomorrow or 5,000 years later, it's still going to come to an end. So that there's no incentive in it then for us to be able to preserve the environment.
You cannot fight greed with logic. Greed is illogical. You are saying, give me a logical reason to combat something as illogical as greed. Greed is rooted in deep-seated human fear. Fear is illogical. So you're saying, give me logic, give me a mathematical template to deal with greedy people. It doesn't work. It won't work.
Property is at the center of every epic battle in India. And brothers on either side. Are we defined by who we are or what we have?
The oldest Greek stories are the epics Iliad and Odyssey.
Right.
And Iliad is the story of the Trojan War, the last year of the Trojan War. And it tells the story of a hero called Achilles, whose participation in battle leads to victory and whose withdrawal leads to defeat. And Odyssey tells the story of another soldier, also from the Trojan War, a Greek warrior called Odysseus, and his return home. So it's the story of two men on a journey. It's a story of its individual characters and what happens to them. They are narrative. Now, around the same time in India, there were two stories, two great epics of India. There's the Ramayan and the Mahabharat. And both are not about individuals. They are about families. They are about political intrigues within the family.
Right.
And it tells you how different India is from the Greek narrative, which strongly influences the Western narrative. If you look at the Ramayan, it can be seen as a story of three brothers taking place across three different zones, one can say. So let's draw a table. I have a habit of doing tables to understand. So you have the set of two brothers, brother 1 and brother 2.
Right.
The first set of brothers are in the city of Ayodhya. Their father is a king called Dashrath. The brother is Ram, and there's another brother called Bharat. The second set of brother is in a jungle in the city, it is called the kingdom of the monkeys or Kishkinda. The father is Riksha. The brother is Bali or Vali. And the other brother is Sugriv. And then there is the third set of brothers in the land of Lanka. The father is a rishi called Vaishrav, sometimes known as Pulatsya. The brother is called Ravan.
Okay.
And his brother is called Kuber.
So not Kumbhakarna or Vibhishan?
No. There is another brother called Kuber.
Okay.
Now let's look at the brothers, what happens with relation to property. You have Dashrath one day coming to Ram and saying that I would like you to renounce your claim to the kingdom of Ayodhya and allowing your brother Bharat to be king.
Right.
And Ram says, okay, without regret or remorse.
Right.
And then Bharat gets the kingdom, and Bharat says, but Ram is the elder brother
And the rightful
and
heir.
the rightful heir. I don't want it. And they say, but for 14 years go to the forest. He says, I'll serve as regent, I'll take care of the kingdom, but I will not sit on the throne. I will place my brother's footwear
Yes.
on the throne and keep it there. And this is almost an ideal relationship. Now, how do you know it's an ideal relationship? Why does Ramayan call it? You see, because the event takes place in the north. Now, not geographical north as we think of it. When they use the word north in literature, they mean the land of the pole star. That which does not move.
Constant.
Which is constant.
Because the pole star is constant.
Because the pole star is constant.
Okay.
So, whenever they use the word north, they mean the land of the pole star.
So it's metaphorical,
It's
not
metaphorical.
geographical.
It's never geographical. It's always metaphorical. And therefore, the land of the pole star represents all that is ideal. So, Shiva's Kailas is in the north, under the pole star.
Okay.
Ram's Ayodhya is in the north. It's under the pole star. It's this perfect space where everything is perfect. And therefore, you're told this is the perfect relationship where brothers can just share kingdom and it's perfectly fine. And then you have far south, so the complete opposite of the land of the pole star, metaphorically, represents land where nothing is stable and static, where there is, everything is changing, and it's a land which of turmoil and fear, is the land of Ravan and Kuber. So Kuber is the king of Yakshas, and he has built this fantastic city called Lanka, made of gold, because Yakshas are the keepers of gold. Now people don't know this, Ravan doesn't build Lanka. He usurps Lanka. He kicks his brother Kuber out of the city and takes over the kingdom. So Lord of Lanka has aggressively acquired what does not belong to him at all. It is not even for his to inherit, because Vaishnav has nothing to do with the kingdom of Lanka. Kuber built it of his own merit, his own capabilities. Right. So there is no father, there's no inheritance issue at all. It's just one man who just decides that I want what my brother has.
And so Ravan takes over his kingdom, a kingdom that is not his.
Not his, and cannot be his because there is no inheritance issue over here at all.
I get that.
And in between you have two brothers called Bali and Sugriv, whose father is the king of this land, and he tells his sons, share Kishkinda. So the two brothers are sharing this kingdom. And there's a misunderstanding. And Bali believes that Sugriv wants him dead and therefore kicks him out. So there's a misunderstanding, and Sugriv is left to fend for himself. And that's when Sugriv meets Ram.
Okay. And at that point, Ram is on his journey to the south to retrieve his wife.
To retrieve his wife, who has been taken by this usurper, who
Ravan.
usurped not only his brother's kingdom, but also another man's wife.
Okay.
So this is the ultimate alpha male. He always takes what others want because he's the dominant male. And Bali is now behaving like the alpha male. He's unwilling to forgive his brother, unwilling to understand, talk it out with him. Any attempt to do that is met with violence. And so a battle is fought between Bali and Sugriv. Only this time Ram supports Sugriv and kills Bali. So Bali has behaved like an animal and has been killed like an animal, where no rules of civilization have applied. So the entire battle is done without the code of conduct of civilization.
Right.
But after that event, now Sugriv has become the king of the monkeys, so he can behave like a monkey, which means be the alpha male. And this is when Ram intervenes and says, no, you cannot go back to being an animal. Now you have to behave what the code of Dharma is, which makes you human, which means you have to first show compassion for the defeated, which means your heir shall not be your son, but the son of your brother Bali, whom you defeated. So Angad. Now that's a very important decision. This is not what happens in the animal kingdom. Right. The alpha male will not adopt the progeny of the defeated. This is what Sugriv is about. So you're talking a transformation. While Bali is very much like Ravan, Sugriv is being made to behave like Bharat. So in a way there is a balancing act. This is the middle space.
Okay.
This is the forest where shifts are taking place. While Ravan, look at Ravan, he is educated. He has 10 heads because he's so intelligent, he's so informed, but yet at a fundamental level behaving like a beast, wanting what others have, and therefore the worst, the not ideal. The land of the pole star is the land of wisdom. That's how metaphorically it's explained. And this is the land of ignorance or Maya.
Okay.
The Maya ki Nagari. So they'll say Lanka
Maya
Nagari.
Yeah.
So that's how it's a phrase which is trying to say that this is the space of delusion. So when human beings kick the brother out,
and take someone else's wife. So
take someone else's wife.
So take what is not rightfully theirs.
Yes.
Right.
In fact, it goes into the question is what is rightfully yours? And that's where the notion of property comes in.
What is the purpose or the reason for why property is at the heart of all these three disputes? May it be that Ram and Bharat did not really fight, but property was at the heart of Bharat's mother's desire to make her son the king as well.
Absolutely.
Right? So for each one of these disputes, property was at the heart.
Yes.
What was the message in that?
Yeah, we have to understand the notion of property. And to understand the notion of property, we have to look back at evolution a bit.
Okay.
Now, what do we have to look back? You see, there is man on one side and there are animals on the other. Now, animals display territorial behavior.
Right.
They're highly territorial. Why are they territorial? Because if they are not territorial, their survival is at stake. Their survival is at stake. Now, human beings are 99% animals. We are mostly animal, and a small part of us is not animal, which is because of our larger brain. Now, if we are animals mostly, so territorial instinct exists even within us. And so we are also seeking survival. Where does property come in? When does territory become property? You see, the difference between man and animal is that human beings have imagination. We imagine who we are.
Right.
We have a notion of who we are. And this has two components: what we are and what we have. I am Devdutt Patnaik. I'm also what I possess.
Right.
While I may die, this is mortal. What I have is immortal. So in a way, through property, because what I have will outlive me, my name will outlive me, my achievements will outlive me, my memory will outlive me, my property.
Your property will outlive you?
That is the great delusion of man.
Okay.
So in a way, I have something called a self-image, which is comprised of not only who I am, but what I have. So if I have more, I have a bigger image than you do. And therefore, so since I want to expand my self-image, I want more and more property.
But it is also the source of the maximum amount of friction.
Yes. Now, the wise man knows this is delusion. The wise man knows that what you are has nothing to do with what you have. So when you look at the Ramayan, on one hand, you have three characters. You have Ram on one side, and then you have Ravan on the other. Ram knows who he is. His character, his personality is not defined by the property or Ayodhya.
Which is why he's so easily able to give it up.
He's so easily give it up. And Bharat, on the other hand, also knows who he is. So his self-image is not dependent on his position as king of Ayodhya. So he doesn't need the kingdom. The kingdom is something else. There is the difference between what I am and what I have is very clear. The two brothers are the wise brothers. They know who they are.
Okay.
But Ravan is not the wise brother. He believes that who he is measured by what he has. So he wants what his brother has. He wants what Ram has. He wants what other men have. He wants everything what others have. Because he measures himself by what he has, which is 90% or 99% of humanity today. Which is what the scriptures are trying to tell. So long as you value yourself on the basis of what you have, you are on a troublesome path.
Would you apply that in this materialistic world as well?
Yes, I would. You see, we have to ask ourselves, why do we want what we want? There is a survival need. You need food, clothing, shelter, you need a comfortable life, you need to live. Those are survival needs. That is recognized. This is recognized. In fact, in the Ramayan, there is a scene in which our sea monster looks at Hanuman and says, I am hungry. So if I eat you now, I have not done any sin because I've eaten you in hunger. But if I eat you in sport, then I've done something wrong.
Or in gluttony.
Or in gluttony.
Right.
Ramayan is asking, what is man's relationship with property? If my self-image, so I'm fighting not for the survival of the self. See, animals are very innocent. Animals are looking at the survival of the self, their physical body, so they fight for it. Human beings are fighting for the self-image. the imagined body, not the physical body.
But isn't it so easy to give up when you have it to begin with? Let's assume for a moment that we wanted to be empathetic towards Ravan. He didn't have it.
Yes.
He wanted it, he desired it. He used the wrong means to acquire it, but desiring it was not incorrect or bad or wrong because he didn't have it. When you have it, it's so easy to take the higher moral ground and say, but I don't want it. I don't need all of this.
Yes.
When you don't have it, that's not a higher moral ground that you want to take.
It's not a question of wanting it or not wanting it. The point is to discover who you are. Find out who you are. In that process, I will acquire wealth, I will lose wealth. Am I the person I am because I have wealth? Or I am the person who I am irrespective of what I possess? Because fortunes will come and go. It is not that if I have a lot, I will be generous. There is no correlation between wealth and generosity. Generosity is who you are, and wealth is what you have. And let's not make that mistake that if I have a lot, I'll be generous. That's corporate social responsibility.
Ouch. That's a double ouch. So I'm curious, right? All the three instances of stories that you've told us are of brothers warring over property, though that may not completely strictly apply to Ram and Bharat because they didn't quite war. But the rift between them, or the reason why Ram had to leave, was property. What is the ideal brotherhood then? Because these are issues that are always going to plague us.
Yes. You see,
so is Ram and Lakshman the ideal brotherhood?
I think the scriptures are not interested in how ideal brothers should behave. It's about who you are. If you are okay, then your relationship with your brother will be okay. Then your relationship with your organization will be okay. Then your relationship, because you will know how to behave in different situations. Because you have figured yourself out. Now, the whole narration therefore focuses on the person who has figured himself out. In fact, that's why you see this very interesting relationship between Ram and Lakshman.
Why do you call it interesting? Because Lakshman followed Ram every step of the way. So to some extent, he was as ideal a brother as Bharat, because Bharat was willing to give up the kingdom or not rule and give up kingship and wait for Ram to return. Lakshman went the step ahead and said, I will follow you around and live the same hardship that you do.
You see, the question is, we celebrate Lakshman. We say, kitna acha bhai hai, such a good brother, loyal brother. But does Ramayan celebrate him?
Doesn't it?
Well, I have my doubts. You see, how does Ram relate to Lakshman? Is a very interesting narrative.
I thought as an older brother, very fond of his younger brother.
Fond, yes. But you see, if I might say that as an elder brother, his job is to tell Lakshman what is really important. And loyalty is not really important, because where does loyalty come from? Does it come from an animal nature where brothers become territories? Or is it coming from a human or the potential divine nature where we look beyond territoriality, where all human beings are my brothers, not just the one who is biologically connected to me?
So are you saying loyalty was a negative attribute in Lakshman?
Let's listen to stories and figure out this. It's never stated very, mythology never states things explicitly, but it implies things. Let's look at what happens to Lakshman's and Ram's relationship after the return
to
Ayodhya. And that reveals something very different. You see, after Ram has become king and he's the great king of Ayodhya, the stories change dramatically. And the loyalty of Lakshman is being tested repeatedly based on conditions put by Ram. And you keep wondering, why is Ram testing his loyalty?
For instance?
You see, Ram takes one of the toughest decisions of his kingship when he decides to abandon Sita as his queen. Now, it's a very complex narrative. Who does he tell to convey this message to Sita? He tells Lakshman to convey this message to Sita. He tells Lakshman, you take her to the forest and leave her there and tell her not to come back and not to identify herself as my wife. Why is he giving Lakshman this task? Lakshman has always represented the average human being because he's a passionate man. He talks from his heart. Lakshman is obviously horrified at this brother's decision. The brother still looks calm and composed and says, just do this. And you're seeing Lakshman almost angry with his brother. And this narrative always shows about he's disappointed and angry and his loyalty is being tested. Is this the brother he respects?
Is this the brother he followed into the forest for 14 years?
Is this the great man he followed in the forest? And suddenly saying, my brother is not the great man. Why is he doing this? Later we are told, when Ram loses the only battle in his life to his children, and Sita then after that goes back under the earth, and the children come back, and the gods come to Ram and say, Ram, it's time for you to die. And Ram says, I have one more task, just one task to complete. He says, what? He says, I'll tell you about it. And he looks at Lakshman and says, I want solitude. I want the room to be shut and I want to stay alone. And Lakshman, like a loyal brother, says, don't worry. If anybody dares enter your chambers, I will guard your chambers. If anybody enters, I will kill them. And Ram says, thank you. And the doors are shut. And the moment the doors are shut, the Rishi Durvasa comes in and tells that I want to meet Ram.
He tells Lakshman that.
He tells Lakshman that. And Lakshman says, sorry, you can't meet him. He wants solitude. And Durvasa is known to be an angry sage. And he looks at Lakshman and says, if you don't let me meet Ram, I will destroy the city of Ayodhya. Now, Lakshman has a Dharma sankat. He has to decide whether he has to obey his brother.
Or allow for the destruction of the city of Ayodhya.
And he takes a decision and he opens the door of his brother's chamber and he says, brother, Rishi Durvasa has come to meet you. And Ram is visibly upset. And he says, but I told you I want solitude. He says, yes, but I couldn't. Ayodhya was at stake. And then Ram smiles and they turn around and there is no Durvasa there. And Lakshman realizes that there is no Durvasa, it was just an apparition. And he looks at his brother and he asks his brother, what was this? He says, you finally realize what matters more. Ayodhya matters more than me. And so now that you have decided and broken your own, now keep your word. You said that you will kill whoever disturbs my solitude. It's time for you to die. And Lakshman then goes into the forest to give up his life.
But why the punishment of death?
Not the punishment. You give, who took that vow that I will kill who breaks solitude?
Lakshman himself.
Yes, so he has to keep that word. Raghukula riti sada chali aayi. The word has to be kept. The same word which made Ram leave the city of Ayodhya and go into exile, the same word which forced Ram to give up his wife, suddenly Lakshman is taught the value of the word, which creates civilization, commitment, contract. You give your word, jaban diya hai, you've given your word, keep it.
Isn't that a little too harsh? The apparition was created by Ram to teach his brother also about the fact that you need to prioritize your duty towards the kingdom more than your brother.
The story is not for Lakshman or for Ram, the story is for us. It is a mythic narrative, a narrative which is trying to tell people what matters more. And this is the story where Lakshman is being told, loyalty doesn't matter, your word matters. Ayodhya matters more. Your wife doesn't matter, your kingdom doesn't matter. What matters more is the people whom you serve as king. They matter the most. In other words, in modern management, it's not the leader doesn't matter, it's the institution, the organization that he builds matters more.
How interesting, because still now Lakshman was always held up as the ideal brother. And you're telling me that Ram in fact taught him a lesson saying that loyalty to your brother cannot be a priority.
What is important is dharma.
But we value loyalty so much.
Why do we value loyalty? Because when I say I have loyal followers, I'm still thinking of what I have, not what I am.
So it's still territorial.
It's still territorial, it's still property. It's just different type of property. It is not physical property as in bank balance. This is property of relationships. So I have brothers, I have followers, mere paas hai vote banks, these are properties. It tells more about what we have, it tells us nothing about what we are.
The symbol of good fortune is a goddess. Amongst the most revered gods, a cowherd and charioteer. We love and worship them no matter what their gender or caste. And yet, India is infamous for the persecution of its women and an entrenched caste system.
How does mythology see gender?
You see, mythology is subjective truth, which is communicated through stories, symbols and rituals. So, what is, okay Menaka, have you ever eaten an eclair chocolate?
Yes, often.
What is the best part of an eclair chocolate?
The middle.
The middle, right?
Right.
So just think of that burst of chocolate that you get. That is the idea. Now, if I want to communicate an idea, I need a form. So that is the chocolate and that is the caramel outside. This is the form. Now, form is of two types. There is a male form and there is a female form. Male form communicates one idea, female form communicates another idea. And that is how male forms and female forms are seen in mythology. It is trying to explain an idea. Now, what is that idea? The idea is that the human, it talks of the relationship of the mind and the world around us. So, mind and world. The mind is represented using a male form and the world is represented using a female form. So, let me explain this in the form of a story. So, they will tell the story of Shiva, the ascetic, whose eyes are shut. And when his eyes are shut, the world is a desolate place. The sun does not shine, it's cold, the wind doesn't move, the water is still, it's snow everywhere. Nothing grows, nothing grows. Until, and what happens in this world? In front of him is the goddess, Kali. And she is wild and naked and bloodthirsty and her hair is flowing in all directions. And she's dancing on top of him. So if you see the images of Kali, Shiva is lying still and she's dancing on top of him. What happens to the world when one is indifferent to it? When one shuts oneself from the world becomes wild when you are indifferent. The moment the eye pay attention, so the indifferent God pays attention, that his eyes open, which means Shiva becomes Shankara. Then the wild goddess who is Kali becomes the gentle domestic goddess called Gauri. So the change in mind brings about a change in the world, and this is expressed in the form of gender, male god, female god. So it's not about God and goddess, it is about mind and world.
So what you're saying is the mind is represented through the male form.
Yes.
The world or matter is represented through the female form. There are only forms to represent ideas.
Yes.
All right. So I don't mean to be a feminist because I really am not, but I'd still like to ask the question, if mind is male and female is matter, is female subservient to male because matter is subservient to mind?
Okay.
Is that what this is trying to tell us?
Okay. First, we must be very careful when we say mind is male.
Mind is represented by male.
Representation and reality are two different things. And this is the biggest mistake that people do when they read mythology. They mistake representation for reality. We are talking about representation of an idea. So the idea is more important than the form. It is not Shiva and Shankara are important as the idea of the mind. And Kali and Gauri are not as important as the idea of our relationship with the world. So just as the... Now, you cannot separate the mind and the world. Now, coming to your question, you said that is the world subservient to the mind? Now, this is a chicken and egg situation. You see, what comes first? Mind, and the other side you have world, or we can use the word matter. Now, it's like asking what came first, culture or nature. Now, nature is always first, and culture comes after that. So, the world is, when we are discussing, from matter comes the mind, and from mind comes matter. This is it. So, the question is if this is represented by a male form, this is represented by a female form. So, where did the male come from? From the female. Where did the female come from? From the male. But they are talking about this mind and world. So, in Rig Veda, you have this famous line which says, Daksha came from Aditi, and Aditi came from Daksha, which means you cannot know what comes first. So, when you see the Ardhanarishwar image, you have Shiva on one side and the goddess on the other. And what they're saying is, one cannot be separated from the other, just as you cannot separate the mind from the world. So my mind and my world are interdependent on each other. My mind is inside, my world is outside. As is my mind, so is my world. So if my mind is like Shiva and shut to the external world, the world outside will become frightening like Kali. And if my mind pays attention to the world as Shankara, then the wild, frightening goddess becomes the gentle, demure Gauri. That's what they are trying to communicate using forms.
There is one thing that still troubles me about this. Why is the mind represented through a male form? Why is the mind not represented through a female form?
Yes.
Why are most of the leaders or the leadership stories told in our mythology told through the male form
Yes.
and not as much through the female form?
Okay, 2 points here. First, let's see, if the mind, if we look at it as leader, and this we look at as organization. Okay, now this question can be answered, why is this used using a male form? And this is true. The data is that leaders are always represented using male forms and organization is always represented using female forms. Is this divide based on patriarchy or is it based on physiology? Now, I belong to the school which says it is based on physiology, not on patriarchy. Because the storytellers or the mythology who created the narratives were interested in the idea. They were not interested in gender politics. Now, let's look at this thing. Physiologically, the man creates life outside his body. Physiological man doesn't create life inside his body. Physiologically, a woman creates life inside her body. So, the male form lends itself best to represent the leader because the leader cannot create wealth alone and within himself. He depends on the organization. Within the organization, he creates wealth. The female form lends itself to represent the organization because within the organization is created wealth just as a woman creates a child. So the female form was most useful in representing the organization. So if the trigger for wealth creation came from the leader, but the actual embodiment of that wealth took place in the organization. Once the idea comes from the leader doesn't matter. Then the organization takes over. It becomes more important than the leader. But can the organization exist independent of the leader? No. Can the leader exist independent of the organization? No. They are codependent on each other like the Ardhanarishwar image.
Because of which there is no attempt to make one
superior to the other. And that's a tragedy. See, the tragedy is people assume that mythology prescribes gender hierarchy. Mythology is not, there is gender hierarchy in society, and then people look at mythology and say, that is where it came from. It's the other way around. So mythology speaks about codependence. Society unfortunately thinks of one being better than the other.
If both are equal, where did gender discrimination come from? If genders were used only to represent ideas, if the male form was used to represent mind and represent leadership, and the female to represent matter and represent organizations, then who vitiated this atmosphere of equality and decided that one was lesser than the other, that being the female?
Okay. Inequality is a human construct. In nature, everybody is equal. Nature treats everybody equally. If you are fit, you will survive. If you are not fit, you will not survive. So nature is the great equalizer. The bowl of rice treats man the same way as it will treat a woman. It will satisfy the hunger of a hungry man. It will satisfy the hunger of a hungry woman. So nature is the great equalizer. But human beings have constructed culture. Now, while we created culture, why did we create culture? To be better than animals. To be something more than animals.
More evolved.
More evolved. The thing is, in the process, something went wrong. You see, animals have the need to dominate. Animals dominate.
Right.
So animals dominate. And humans also want to dominate.
So we haven't fully given up or shed our animal skin, so to speak.
Yes. But why do animals dominate? They dominate to survive. Because if they dominate, they have access to more food.
Right.
Why do humans dominate? Because they want for the survival of their imagination. This imaginary self that they have, where they want to feel more important than others. And therefore, what do we do? In culture, we create structures. We create structures which give one group of people a more dominant position than others. Now, what are the methods to create this? We create what is called a pyramid. And we create a pyramid which says that, on the basis of color, that is one way. On the basis of gender. Then on the basis of birth.
Does mythology give a sanction to discrimination, whether it's gender discrimination or caste-based or birth? Discrimination based on where you were born or how you were born or who you were born to?
See, as I have said repeatedly in every show of mine, mythology is not prescriptive, it is reflective. what does it reflect upon? It reflects that any society anywhere in the world, not just Indian society, African society, society of the Inuit Indians and the Native Americans and the Europeans and Australians, any society in the world, the moment you have culture, you will have a hierarchy. So there is a Purusha Shukta hymn which comes in the Rig Veda, one of the earliest hymns written in India, which describes the organization, any organization, whether it's an organization like a company, a corporate organization, or a social organization. Every organization is actually an organism.
Right.
And the organism has parts, has many parts, which means when it says it has many parts, it's basically saying that each part is unique and in its identity and different from the other parts. So it recognizes inequality, because inequality depends on the measure that you have. If I measure people on the basis of intellect, some people have more intellect, some people have less intellect. If I measure society on the basis of emotion, some people are more emotional, some people are less emotional. If I measure people on the basis of physical strength, then some people have more physical strength and some people have less physical strength. Now, which is better? Which of these three parameters is considered a superior human being?
More always.
But more which one? Intellect, emotion, or physical?
Depends on what the need of the hour
Depend
is.
on the need of the hour. So what mythology does, and in Hindu mythology, in the Rig Veda, the Purusha Shukta acknowledges this fact, acknowledges that there is hierarchy in every organization. Or let me put it this way, not hierarchy, difference.
Okay.
They're two different words. So it looks at an organization as an organism. So an organism as a head, has a torso, has hands and feet.
Right.
So one portion, the intellectual portion, was considered the head,
The thinker.
the thinker,
The thinking part.
the thinking part.
Okay.
Then that which got things done was, or the one
The planner?
the planner, the executive part,
Okay. Was the hand.
the hand. There was the part which focused on the value, the financial value of an organization, which measured things constantly,
Okay.
kept things in check. You could call the control systems which were there. And then you have the things that actually got you moving from point one to point B, without which there would be no movement. And that's the labor, or it could be the
people who execute.
execute.
Yeah.
So you can look at this as a corporate organization. You have the design cell, which designs and strategizes. You have the planning cell, you have the control cell, and you have the execute cell.
Right.
And if one part functions better than the other, the organization will not succeed. You need every part to work together. Now what happens is, somewhere along the line, one part takes greater importance than the other. So imagine a company where the finance is most powerful and the HR is ignored. It will be a very strange organization where everything's about control, control, control. Nothing is about human beings. Imagine a company where the strategic department takes all the credit. The implementation will be terrible, and that's the biggest problem of the 21st century. And if you read all the books in the market, they talk about implementation. If only implementation is focused on and strategy is not looked at, then long term you will suffer. If strategy is there and implementation, but there's no planning, there'll be complete chaos in the organization. So every part is important, but the fact is differences are there. The question is, sometimes, and this is where the problem starts, when one part gets more importance than the other, then the trouble starts, because then hierarchy, differences gives rise to hierarchy. We must always remember that acknowledgement of difference does not mean that it is a sanction for discrimination.
But if I was to use this as an analogy for India's caste system, and if I was to use the politically incorrect word right now of Brahmin, and say the thinker is the Brahmin,
Yes,
right?
okay.
Mythology has, over thousands of years, given the Brahmin an exalted position in
Yes.
society.
Yes.
While everybody else is equally important, somehow the Brahmin is more important than everybody else.
Yes.
How did this get embedded and ingrained in our thinking
Yes.
to the extent that it became a rigid caste system and not a system which believed that each one has its own importance and his own place,
Absolutely.
and each one is important at a particular point in time, right?
Let's separate the reality of society from the thoughts that mythology is trying to communicate, and this society is being informed by a set of stories, and how much have we actually heard? There is clearly a delta between what is being communicated and what is being heard and imbibed.
Okay.
Okay, let's keep that as a hypothesis.
Okay.
So let's accept that we know that our society has almost some dehumanizing practices, you know,
Right.
denying people water, touch. I mean, there is no way on earth that you can justify that under any circumstances.
And yet they use the scriptures
They
to
use the
justify
scriptures.
this.
So let's relook at the scriptures. Let's
Right.
put the lens back on the scriptures and see what the scriptures are saying. Let's look at the word Brahmin. It means someone who facilitates the discovery of Brahman. This word comes from the Upanishads. It basically means the infinite potential of a human being to outgrow his animal instincts and discover divinity. So this is the infinite potential that all of us possess. Every human being possesses this. And what
So
is the
Brahman is a quality.
is a quality. And he who facilitates this journey was called a Brahmin.
Okay.
This has to be separated from another word which means Brahma, which is the word for creator.
Right.
And remember, in India, we don't worship the creator. What did he create that he's unworthy of worship?
You've told us this in a previous episode, the rat race.
The rat race. He
Right.
created the competitive spirit, which is suitable for animals fighting over resources.
But not for human beings
Not
trying to
for human-
outgrow their animal instincts.
Absolutely. So this is the model, right? Now let's look at Ramayan and Mahabharat. In the Ramayan, who is the villain? It is Ravan. What is Ravan? Repeatedly the narrative is Ravan is a Brahmin.
He's the thinker.
He's the thinker.
So we have to be careful here with the use
of
of
the word.
Brahmin, because in India today,
Yeah.
it is a political issue,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So let's make it clear to our viewers that we're using Brahmin as a substitute for the word thinker.
Thinker. Ravan is a thinker. He's supposed to be, he comes from the family of thinkers. He has got 10 heads. That means he's capable of thinking much more than others.
Most people,
So
yes.
what is it that he's supposed to do? He's supposed to direct people in this direction.
Right.
Towards
the
out-
discovery of Brahman.
Of Brahman. And what does he behave like? He's competitive,
Right.
and he celebrates his animal instincts. And so the Ramayan looks at the destruction of Ravan. Now, it is the greatest sin. The killing of the Brahman is the greatest sin. And that's what the scripture is actually showing. Ram is saying that no, this is unacceptable. This behavior is unacceptable. But he still celebrates the idea of the thinker. And so after killing Ravan, he performs an act of penance, saying that I respect the idea
Of
not the
the
person,
thinker.
of the thinker,
And definitely not what the person has
not
become.
what the person has become. Now look at the Mahabharat. In here you have a teacher called Drona. He is a Brahmin too. And what does he create? Students who fight with each other over property. What kind of a thinker is this? What kind of a teacher is this? What is Drona attached to? Drona is attached to his son called Ashwatthama.
Okay.
And he's so attached to his son that he justifies his entire life based on that, his son, and taking care of his son. So he earns money for his son, he gives tuitions for his son, he builds empires for his son. He sees a family breaking itself, breaking apart and fighting a great war, and he doesn't feel there's anything wrong. He's the teacher. He has the teacher of the Kauravas and Pandavas, and what has he taught them? What has all that education led to? Potentially a great massacre. And he's not ashamed of it. He feels, well, he's almost sounding like a professional, saying I did what I did and they are responsible for it. And so in the battlefield, Krishna says he's so attached to his son, he's so obsessed with his son. Let's use his son against him. Let's tell him that Ashwatthama is dead. And the man is so attached to his son, he doesn't wait to find out whether the Ashwatthama who is dead is his son or an elephant which has been killed by Bhima. And he lays down his weapons and says that I will not fight. My son is dead. He just assumes his son is dead. This is how obsessed he is with his son, that he lays down his weapon and he is beheaded. His head is cut off. Now this is a recurring theme in mythology. You have Brahma's head is cut off in mythology because he creates the competitive world. His head is cut off by Shiva. You have Ravan, who is killed by Ram. You have Drona, whose death is sanctioned by Krishna. It's almost as if they are going on the wrong path. The thinker is taking the society in a wrong direction. It shall not be forgiven. What he's supposed to do, any thinker, any leader, any designer, any strategist of an organization, is to take human beings to their higher potential, not to their base values.
The famous Indian head shake, not yes, not no, but maybe, always looking for a way out. Scant regard for rules or structures. Fatalistic, maybe even laid back, a chalta hai attitude and a jugaru approach. So, who are we?
Who are we, Devdutt? Because if we're people who believe in multiple life theories, if we're people who believe in destiny, because our multiple lives and our actions of previous lives lays out for us what's to come in the next life, then are we also people who are fatalistic and therefore accepting on the good side, but very laid back on the bad side? Why are we not as driven as the West?
Okay, for this I have to tell you two stories. So let's begin first with the story of a lady called Gautami. Now, Gautami is a widow and she has only one son. And one day the son goes into the forest and is bitten by a snake and he dies. And the snake is caught by a hunter called Arjunika. And the hunter comes to Gautami and says, I have caught the snake who killed your son. Shall I punish the snake? And Gautami says, no, let it go. It will not bring my son back. It is not the snake that killed my son. It is karma that killed my son. My son had a karmic baggage which determined the time of his death and the circumstances of his death. And the snake was but an instrument. So there's no point being angry with the servant. This is classical fatalism, surrendering to the truth of the moment. So this is belief in destiny or karma. Okay. On the other side, we have another story. It's the story of Savitri. Now, who is Savitri? Savitri is a princess who chooses to marry a man destined to die a year later. She is a princess and she falls in love with this woodcutter and she says, I want to marry this man, even though the astrologers say, but he's going to die in a year's time. And she says, no, I love him, I'll still marry him. And she marries him. On the day, 1 year later, when he dies, she follows the god of death. And the god of death is taking her husband's soul to the land of the dead. She follows Yama. And Yama is irritated and says that, why are you following me? Take care of your husband's body. And he says, that is but a vessel. The real thing which matters is in your hand. I want it back. And she says, no, according to the rule books,
his time is up.
So surrender to reality. And she refuses to surrender. She keeps following him. To the point comes where he gets exasperated and says, okay, fine, I'll give you 3 wishes. Anything but the life of your husband. So she says, first wish, let my father-in-law's fortunes be restored. The second wish, let my father's get an heir to his throne, because I'm the only child, I'm a daughter, I have married, so he has nobody in his life, let an heir be born to him. And the third, she says, let me bear Satyavan's sons. And Yama says, so be it, to all 3. And moves on to the land of the dead. After some time, he finds that Savitri is still following him. She says, but listen, I promised you 3 things, and I've given you those 3 things. And she says, I agree, thank you very much for that. But you see, the last wish was, I should be the mother of Satyavan's son. How can I bear his sons when he's dead? And Yama bursts out laughing and says that, oh, you clever lady, you are not only determined, but you're also clever. And you're also generous, because first you gave a wish to your father-in-law, then your father, only then to yourself. So you deserve the life of your husband back. So I give it back to you. In mythology, which talks about death cannot be overturned, you have the character of a woman who overturns the most ultimate fatalistic thing, which is death, and brings her husband back from the dead. The impossible happens. So where does it come from? It comes from what is called her desire. So desire is another force, or will, or karma. So karma on one side and karma on the other. Savitri's story on one side and Gautami's story on the other. These two are the 2 extremes of Indian thought.
So are we more like Gautami or are we more like Savitri?
again, this has to be explained in the form of a story. You see, in the Upanishads, there's a very famous sage called Yagyavalkya. And Yagyavalkya says that when he's asked the same question, what is life? What is the truth? Who are we? Is it about destiny or is it about desire? And he says, just visualize yourself traveling on a chariot which has two wheels. You know, two wheels. One is destiny or karma, the other is desire or kama. If you depend on one wheel too much, you will go around in circles. So you need sometimes, depending on the situation, you surrender to your destiny. Depending on the situation, you succumb to your desire and make your journey through life.
So that means we need to believe in one or the other based on the context.
Based on the context, on the situation. Jaisa yug, vaisa avatar. As is the situation, so should be your action.
How does this reflect in our business practices?
Just talk to people who do business with Indians. You will notice how exasperated they are. Typically people from Europe and America who are binary thinkers. They want a yes and no answer.
Not a maybe.
Not a maybe. While Indians love saying maybe, mostly. Why do they say that?
Shayad.
Shayad. Because they're always thinking that there is perhaps a better way out. And this is the power of the Indian and the weakness of the Indian at the same time. We are constantly thinking contextually. We do not believe in standardized answers. We want everything is customized.
There's a beautiful word that describes this exact philosophy in business, right?
What is that?
It's jugaad.
In a recent feature on management practices in the East, The Economist said, Indians often see frugal innovation as their distinctive contribution to management thinking. They point to the national tradition of jugar, meaning, roughly, making do with what you have and never giving up, and cite many examples of ordinary Indians solving seemingly insoluble problems.
You mentioned an interesting thing. You said it is our strength and our weakness.
Yes.
Is jugaad good or is it bad?
Again, the answer is maybe. But you see, the word jugaad is a North Indian word, and when you use the word, there is a sense implicit in the word. When you say the word is mischief, is prank, there's something not right about that word. There's a negative connotation to that word. And yet when the word jugaad is used in the eastern parts of the country, like Odia, I mean, my mother would use the word jugadu, she didn't really mean it in the same way as you say it in Hindi. She would mean it in the form of resourceful.
Okay.
A resourceful person. A jugadu is both a resourceful person, but he's also a person who is able to go through the cracks between the lines and find his way into it. He's able to improvise. He's able to innovate. So it depends on the situation and depends on the outcome. If the outcome favors us, we say jugad is good. If the outcome doesn't favor us, we say it's bad. The problem with the mindset of a jugad is that nothing can be taken for granted. It doesn't allow for planning.
Okay.
It doesn't allow for systems to be constructed. So you suddenly feel lost in a system where everybody is improvising. You're not sure what is happening out there. And that is a negative part of this, the jugaad mindset. The good part is that it's more about relationships. It's more about people. It's about people feeling powerful, of saying that, you know, no matter what the situation, no matter what the odds, no matter what the scarcity, we will figure a way out.
You've listed an equal number of pros and cons. So will jugaad take us forward? Will it hold us back?
It is who we are. The fact is, it is who we are. The question is, it is up to us to harness it and take us forward. And if we don't harness it, if we wish it away, it won't go away. It will always be there. The question is, do we consider it as a factor when we are designing our cities, when we are making our plans, when we are making our business plans? We sometimes forget that Indians, the nature of who we are, and rather than looking down upon it and wishing it away and hoping to sort of condition and decondition Indians and make them something different, let's see this as an attribute and turn it into a strength, which sometimes we don't.
Can you really design something for people who are more creatively driven and therefore more unpredictable? Yes. It's difficult to do that, right? A system requires predictability.
Yes.
Very tough to harness unpredictable creativity to create systems.
This is a very good point. You see, it's about predictability. When you need predictability, you talk about processes and systems.
Right.
But you see, in a country like India, where everything is unpredictable, people have always relied on
But we
relationship.
make it so.
Now, how do we now create the innovative solution between?
Yeah.
That is the journey that we will take place in the next 10, 20 years as India becomes a more important. Let's look at examples that we can do. We can focus on results rather than on methods. This is one way of looking at it. This is one way. The other method could be, 80% will be defined by process, but 20% will be allowed for human freedom.
For jugar.
For jugaad to happen. Recognize the fact that don't give everything in detail. You see what happens, especially in multinational organizations, there is a need to define everything to the last minute, and because we almost don't trust the human intelligence. We feel
manual.
Unless the manual exists, people can't function. Many people can function without the manual. Recognize that and say that, okay, broad frameworks and broad guidelines will be given. You see, somewhere along the line, we believe that with processes, we will force people to have integrity. Integrity has nothing to do with processes.
All right, as we're talking about this difference between India, creativity, jugaad, West, systems, predictability, we have a question from your boss, Kishore Biani, and he quite beautifully articulates the difference in belief and behavior between the two, the West and the East. Let's listen into him.
What is the model one should adopt? I think we need to create a blend wherein processes and systems can be driven out of the Western way, but the softer side of dealing with human beings, with consumers, with organizational behavior, I think we need an Indian model of learning, development, and probably leadership.
Interesting, Devdutt, because this brings us back to the very first question that we started this series with, and that is there an Indian way of doing business, right? A way that blends the Western and the Eastern way of doing things, a way that blends the process and the people focus.
Yes.
Is there one?
Yes, there is. But to understand this, we go back into a little bit of history of management science.
Okay.
And you see, 300 years ago, a great revolution took place in Europe. Until then, Europe was controlled by the king, the monarchy, and the church, and their will was law. And then a whole bunch of people came and said that, it can't work like this. A church and kings cannot just decide what is right and what is wrong. Right and wrong has to be defined by logic. So this is where Voltaire came into the picture, and the Renaissance took place, and then Voltaire came into the picture, and then you have Hegel, and you have Newton, and the scientists, and the discoveries, the inventions took place, the Industrial Revolution took place, which was based on reason. It was called the Age of Reason and the Age of Industrial Revolution. Everything had to be logical, rational, real. Management science is a product of that way of thinking. But somewhere along the line, we assumed that what came from this thought was universal, and because it is logical. Now the problem comes is when these ideas came to the East, so they came to China, they came to India, they were imported and imposed. However, in the 1970s, something very interesting happened. A whole set of thinkers emerged again, who were called the post-modern thinkers, who said that what we assume to be logical is a function of culture. See, that is where I feel mythology has a lot to add to management. See, management emerged from the desire for creating an objective reality, which is absolute and perfect and independent of human beings. I'm saying that is one half of the brain, the left brain. But can we pay attention to the other half of the brain, which has been ignored and rejected 300 years ago, the right half of the brain, which says that people are individuals, and every individual has a subjective reality. Respect and appreciate that subjective reality, otherwise conflict will happen.
Is there, and this is my final question to you, in this season of this series of Business Sutra, is there the embodiment of an organization anywhere in mythology? Does mythology talk about the perfect organization, the perfect business, the perfect enterprise?
Yes, it does. You see, why does an organization exist? First, let's ask that question. An organization exists because we can't cope with the forest, the wild nature. Wild nature frightens us. We want to feel safe and secure, and therefore we created human beings created organization. But the problem with organizations is organizations end up domesticating people. We domesticate, the wild is made tame. And we don't like domestication because we want to be ourselves, which is, we are born free and we want to live free lives. And so we are trying to negotiate a path between the forest and the organization, between being wild and being domestic. And to me, the best representation of this is Krishna's Rasa Leela. You see, what is the Rasa Leela? Rasa Leela is a dance. It's a dance which takes place in the forest. So forest, a place of fear. It takes place at night. It takes place outside the village, which means outside the organization. So there's no organization out there. And yet, everybody who's participating in the Rasa Leela is completely unafraid. There is no fear. They are dancing and having a good time, and there's perfect organization. They form a circle, which means there is an organization there. And they're all circle because they're equidistant from the leader, who treats them equally, yet each one feels special. And that is Krishna in the center. And these are the gopis dancing around him in this wild forest. Now let's look at not afraid at all. And there's no reason for them to be there. They're not bound by custom, law, systems, processes, obligations. They're there of their own free will and yet complying and creating this perfect circle. Nobody's coming in and disturbing the circle. In fact, if one does that, Krishna disappears. The fear returns. So what are we saying? If the forest is the marketplace, can my leader be like Krishna, who gives me complete freedom to do what I want, and yet I voluntarily align to the system? So it means that where I do 100% or come on time and go on time and do 100% work, not because I'm obliged by a contract, but dil se, with passion, with bhakti. And that's the core of Indian philosophy. To do it with integrity and with devotion, not because a law tells me to do so. And can we achieve that? Well, that's the promised land of India.
This was the final episode of Season 1 of Business Sutra. All 10 episodes of this season are now available on DVD.